The Wyoming Territory stretched empty under a February sky, the valley floor locked in frost. The ridgeline above it. Below, a barn stood in the darkness of Whetstone Hollow, its weathered boards silver with age, its east wall beginning to glow from the outside in. Inside, 23 pieces of handmade furniture lined the walls. An armchair designed by a dead man who never found the courage to build it himself.
The smell of smoke reached her before the heat did. She was on her feet before the thought finished forming. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed open. Somewhere ahead, the fire was already winning.
The morning wind carried the smell of pine sap across Whetstone Hollow long before the wagon appeared, its wheels grinding over the frozen ruts of Elk Trace Road with a sound like bones cracking under the weight of something nobody wanted. April had come late to the Wyoming Territory, that year of 1882, the snow retreating in slow, grudging patches from the hillsides, while the mud beneath it turned the roads into channels of brown water that sucked at hooves and boot heels alike. The wagon belonged to Lemuel Stroud's sawmill, a flatbed rig pulled by two dappled mares whose breath steamed in the early chill, driven by a quiet young man named Corwin Felt, who kept his hat low over his eyes, not out of shame but out of habit. The way a person learns to move through the world without drawing attention when attention has never done him any good. The load on the wagon was not lumber in any respectable sense of the word. It was the refuse of lumber, the aftermath of it, the parts that the saws at Stroud's mill had chewed through, found wanting, spit out. Bark slabs with the cambiums still wet. Boards warped so badly they curved like the ribs of a starving horse. Offcuts too short to frame a window, too knotted to plane flat, too split along the grain to hold a nail without crumbling. Every week, Lemuel Stroud paid Corwin $3 to haul this wreckage down Elk Trace Road to the burn pile behind the Mercantile in Copper Bend, where it would be set alight on Saturday mornings by whichever boy in town needed a nickel badly enough to stand downwind of the smoke. Every week for the past 10 months, the wagon had stopped first at the gate of Dunmore Ranch. Corwin pulled the mares to a halt beside the leaning fence post where someone had once nailed a tin sign reading Dunmore, but where weather had scoured the letters down to a ghost of themselves, legible only if you already knew what they spelled. He did not call out. He did not need to. Before the wheels had fully stopped turning, two figures emerged from the gray barn at the far end of the yard, moving with the kind of quiet purpose that suggested they had been listening for this sound the way other women listened for church bells. Rosalind Dunmore reached the gate first, as she always did, because Rosalind was the one whose body never quite learned to be still. She was 25 years old, lean in the way that women became lean when the work outpaced the food, with chestnut hair pulled back in a single braid that fell past her shoulder blades, its end frayed from catching on things she was too busy to notice. Her hands were the most remarkable thing about her if you thought to look, which most people did not. They were calloused across the palms, nicked with small scars along the fingers, the knuckles slightly swollen from repetitive work, the nails trimmed short not for vanity, but because long nails split when you gripped a draw knife. They were not the hands of a 25-year-old woman in the Wyoming Territory. They were the hands of someone who had been building something in secret for a very long time. Jessamine came behind her sister by 6 steps, carrying a canvas sack for the smaller pieces. She was identical to Rosalind in the ways that mattered to strangers. The same height, the same brown eyes, the same narrow jaw, but different in the ways that mattered to anyone who stayed long enough to notice. Jessamine moved more slowly, not from weakness, but from the particular steadiness of a person who measured everything twice before committing. She kept a leather-bound ledger in the front pocket of her apron at all times, a habit inherited from their mother, who had believed that a woman who did not know her own numbers would always be at the mercy of someone who did. Where Rosalind's hands bore the marks of chisels, Jessamine's fingertips were perpetually stained with linseed oil, the amber residue of hours spent rubbing finish into wood until the grain glowed like something alive beneath her touch. They had been born 9 minutes apart in a cabin 3 miles east of where they now stood, on a night their father Orrin later described as the coldest he had ever endured, not because of the weather, but because he had spent those 9 minutes believing he had lost Tabitha along with the first child before the second one arrived, screaming into a world that was not yet ready for either of them. Corwin climbed down from the seat, walked to the back of the flatbed, began tossing the scrap wood over the side into the usual pile near the gate. He worked without speaking, the way he always did, though his eyes tracked Rosalind as she knelt in the dirt beside the pile, sorting through the refuse with her hands, separating the warped boards from the bark slabs from the knotted offcuts, each into its own stack with a speed that told him she already knew what each piece would become before she touched it. Couple of ash pieces near the bottom today, he offered, the most he had spoken to her in 3 weeks of deliveries. Rosalind glanced up. Ash holds a chisel mark better than pine. Thank you for noticing, that was all. Corwin touched the brim of his hat, climbed back up, guided the mares forward onto the road toward Copper Bend. He looked back once in the side mirror of his memory, though he would not have called it that, just a habit of turning his head at the bend in the road, to see the two sisters kneeling together in the dirt, surrounded by wood that no one else in the territory would have bent down to pick up. On the fence line across the road, Dorothea Vernell was watching. She had not come to watch the Dunmore sisters specifically. She had come to walk the fence line of her husband's property, because a section of wire had come down in the last storm, a task Harland himself could not be troubled to inspect on a morning when the saloon in Copper Bend opened early for a cattle auction. But Dorothea had stopped walking the moment she heard the wagon, the way she always stopped, because the spectacle of 2 grown women sorting through sawmill garbage on their hands and knees was the kind of thing that drew the eye whether you intended it to or not. Lord in heaven. Dorothea's voice carried across the still morning air with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring her opinions reached their intended targets. Still at it, every single week, picking through that rubbish like a pair of crows fighting over a corn husk. She was speaking to no one in particular, which was how Dorothea preferred to deliver her verdicts, into the open air where they could land on whichever ear God intended. Her face, weathered by prairie wind into a permanent expression of skeptical appraisal, softened only slightly as she watched Jessamine struggle to lift a particularly heavy slab of bark. A shame, truly, their mother was a sensible woman. Tabitha would have wept to see this. Dorothea did not know what became of the wood once it disappeared into the barn. Nobody in Copper Bend did. That was not because the sisters had gone to any particular effort to hide their work, but because nobody had bothered to walk the 40 yards from the road to the barn door to find out. Curiosity, in a town like Copper Bend, ran in only one direction, outward, toward gossip, toward the comfortable distance from which judgment could be passed without the inconvenience of evidence. The town itself sat in a shallow valley where Elk Trace Road crossed the creek that gave the place its name, a bend in the water where copper ore had once been found in quantities too small to mine but large enough to name a settlement after. Copper Bend in the spring of 1882 consisted of a mercantile, a saloon, a church whose steeple leaned 7 degrees to the east because the carpenter who built it had been drinking, a post office that doubled as the land office, a blacksmith, a livery stable, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Ferris who asked no questions of her tenants because she preferred not to know the answers, a one-room schoolhouse, a cemetery on the hill above the church where the headstones outnumbered the living residents by a ratio that was growing less comfortable with each passing winter, a scattering of ranch houses spread across the surrounding valley floor like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Population, 143 souls, if you counted the Dunmore sisters, which not everyone did. The sisters had been a subject of town conversation for the better part of 2 years, ever since the fever had taken Orrin first, then Tabitha 6 days later, in the brutal winter of 1880 to 1881. The timing had been cruel in the way that frontier death often was, without warning, without fairness, without the decency to space itself out enough for the living to catch their breath between losses. Tabitha had gone on a Tuesday quietly, in the night, her breathing simply stopping the way a candle flame stops when the wax is spent. Orrin had held on until Monday, though whether he held on for the sake of his daughters or simply because his body was slower to surrender than his wife's was a question that Rosalind would turn over in her mind for years without reaching an answer. They had buried their parents side by side on the ridge above the ranch house, beneath a crooked lodgepole pine that Orrin talked about cutting down every summer for 15 years without ever doing it. The tree was still there. The parents were not. Rosalind sometimes thought that was the most honest summary of her father's character she could offer. He was a man who always meant to do the practical thing, but whose heart kept finding reasons to leave the impractical things standing. After the funerals, the town had expected certain outcomes. The Dunmore Ranch was modest. 160 acres of marginal grazing land, a cabin, a barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar, one aging mule named Buck, who had outlived his usefulness by several years, but whom Orrin had refused to sell because the animal had once pulled him out of a creek during a flash flood, a debt of loyalty that Orrin considered binding. 2 unmarried women could not run such a place alone. This was not opinion in Copper Bend. This was physics. The land required things that women, by the town's reckoning, could not provide: the weight of a man behind a plow, the authority of a man at the feed store, the simple gravitational fact of a man's name on a deed. Harland Varnell had come by the ranch 11 days after the second funeral, with an offer to buy the property at a price he described as fair, which meant it was roughly 60% of what the land was worth during a good year, which this was not. Harland was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had learned that opportunity wore many faces, some of them grieving, and that a person who waited too long to extend a hand often found the hand extended by someone else. Rosalind had met him at the gate. She listened to his offer with her arms folded across her chest, her face giving away nothing, which was a skill she had learned from watching her father negotiate with horse traders. When Harland finished speaking, she had been quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make him shift his weight from one boot to the other. "Mr. Varnell, I appreciate you coming out. The answer is no. This land belonged to our father, who got it from his father before him, who walked here from Pennsylvania with nothing but a mule that was meaner than Buck, which is saying something. We are not selling." Harland had studied her face for some sign of uncertainty, found none, tipped his hat, driven home. He told Dorothea that evening over supper that the Dunmore girls would last until the first hard frost, maybe the second if they were stubborn about it, but that by Christmas they would come around. Christmas came. The sisters did not come around. They mended the fence that the November wind had torn down. They patched the barn roof where the snow weight had opened a gap wide enough to see stars through. They plowed a small kitchen garden with Buck, who was old but not yet so old that he could not be persuaded by a handful of oats to drag a blade through frozen soil. They survived the winter on potatoes, dried venison, the eggs from 6 hens whose production Jessamine tracked in her ledger with the precision of a bank auditor. The town watched this survival with a kind of admiration that quickly soured into resentment, because nothing unsettles a community more than being proven wrong about what a person can endure. It was the wood that pushed the town's bewilderment into something harder. The sisters had begun collecting scrap lumber in the summer of 1881, roughly 4 months after burying their parents, starting small, a few pieces from a broken fence rail, a plank pulled from a collapsed section of the chicken coop. Rosalind had found her father's tools in the barn: a draw knife with a hickory handle worn smooth by decades of use, a mallet whose head was slightly loose, 3 chisels of varying widths dulled from years of rough carpentry, a hand plane missing one of its adjustment screws. Orrin Dunmore had been what the territory called a fair hand, meaning he could fix a wagon bed, replace a porch step, build a shelf that held level, the kind of carpentry that solved problems without aspiring to beauty. Rosalind had picked up the draw knife on a June evening, not because she had any intention of becoming a woodworker, but because the silence inside the cabin after supper had become a sound in itself, a high, thin ringing that filled the rooms where voices used to be. Her mother's rocking chair sat empty by the stove. Her father's coat still hung on the peg by the door. The house was full of objects that belonged to people who no longer existed, objects that waited with a terrible patience for hands that would never touch them again. Rosalind needed something to hold that would not remind her of what she had lost. The draw knife was impersonal. The wood was impersonal. The work was impersonal. She could pour her grief into it without having to name the grief, which was the only way she knew how to carry it. She began with a spoon. It took her 3 evenings to finish, its bowl lopsided, its handle too thick, its surface rough with tool marks she did not yet know how to smooth. She held it up to the lantern light, turning it over in her fingers, feeling ridiculous, feeling relieved, feeling something she could not identify that sat between those two emotions, like a bridge she had not known was there. Jessamine found her working the 4th evening. She stood in the barn doorway watching her sister shape a second spoon from a piece of pine fence rail, the lantern casting Rosalind's shadow long across the dirt floor, the scraping of the draw-knife the only sound in the still night air. "You are not just whittling." Jessamine's voice was soft, not a question, not an accusation, something closer to recognition. "I can see it in your hands. You are talking to something." Rosalind did not look up. She turned the spoon over, feeling the grain beneath her thumb the way a blind person reads the face of someone they love, by touch, by instinct, by the accumulated memory of 1,000 previous contacts. "Maybe I am. You can say it to me too. Whatever it is, I know." Rosalind set the spoon down carefully on the workbench. "But wood does not cry when I am sad, it just waits." Something passed between them in that moment, a current of understanding that ran deeper than words, the particular frequency that only twins could share, that had hummed between them since the womb, since the 9 minutes of separation that had been the longest either of them would ever endure. Jessamine crossed the barn, picked up a piece of rough pine from the pile, ran her fingers along its surface. She did not know yet what she was looking for. She only knew that her sister had found something in this barn that the empty house could not provide, a way to keep living that did not require pretending. The dead were not dead. Over the months that followed, the work evolved. What began as spoons became combs, then small boxes with lids that fit, then a stool whose 3 legs held steady on the uneven barn floor. Rosalind taught herself from the battered book on cabinetry she found among her father's possessions, a volume with a cracked leather spine whose pages were annotated in Orrin's careful hand, margin notes that read like a conversation between a man who understood the theory of fine woodwork but had never quite believed he was permitted to practice it. "Beautiful joint but too slow for paid work," one note read beside an illustration of a dovetail. "Would like to try this if time allowed." Read another beside a drawing of a mortise, Centenan chair frame, the conditional tense of a man who had spent his life building what was needed rather than what was possible. Several pages near the back had been torn out. The ragged edges remained, visible between the binding stitches, but the pages themselves were gone. Rosalind noticed this absence, wondered about it briefly, set the wondering aside. There was too much work to do to spend time thinking about missing pages. Jessamine, meanwhile, discovered her own gift. She could not shape wood the way Rosalind could. Her hands lacked the particular instinct for the tool's edge, the ability to read the grain 3 cuts ahead the way a chess player reads the board. But she could see proportion the way a musician hears pitch, intuitively, immediately, without needing to measure. She knew when a chair leg was a 1/4 inch too thick before Rosalind's eye caught it. She knew when a tabletop's edge needed to be eased by another pass of the plane to achieve the visual weight the piece demanded. She sanded each finished surface until it felt like riverstone beneath her palm, then rubbed in linseed oil with a cloth until the grain emerged from the raw wood like a face emerging from fog, warm, golden, alive. She began sketching designs in her ledger between the columns of egg counts, the flour inventory, the careful accounting of every penny the ranch consumed, a rocking chair, a cradle, though there was no child to fill it, a hutch with doors that would swing true on wooden hinges. The designs grew more ambitious as the months passed, outpacing the sisters' current skills, reaching toward something neither of them could yet name, but both of them could feel, a future that existed only in pencil lines on paper, waiting for hands skilled enough to bring it into the world. By the time the weekly scrap deliveries became a ritual, in the autumn of 1881, the workshop in the back half of the barn held a modest but growing collection of finished pieces. 6 stools, 2 small tables, a chest with dovetailed corners that Rosalind had built over 4 weeks of evenings, ruining 3 attempts before she managed joints tight enough to hold without glue. a set of shelves whose proportions Jessamine had adjusted twice during construction, forcing Rosalind to disassemble what she had built because the spacing was wrong by an inch that only Jessamine's eye could detect. "Nobody will ever see this," Rosalind had said during the second disassembly, frustration thinning her voice. "Nobody comes in here." "We see it," Jessamine replied in the tone of someone stating a fact so obvious that arguing with it would be like arguing with gravity. "That is enough." It was not enough, of course. Both sisters knew this, though neither said it aloud. The workshop was a refuge. But a refuge is not a future. The ranch was bleeding money. Buck was aging. The hens were producing fewer eggs as the weather cooled. The root cellar held enough preserved food to survive another winter, but not enough to feel safe about it. Jessamine's ledger told the story in numbers that grew smaller with each passing month, the slow arithmetic of a life that was sustainable in the way a held breath is sustainable. Possible for now, impossible forever. The scrap wood was free. That was why it mattered. Every piece of refuse that the sawmill discarded was a piece of raw material that cost the sisters nothing but the labor of carrying it from the gate to the barn. In a life where every other resource was shrinking, the wood was the one thing that kept arriving, week after week, asking nothing in return except to be shaped into something better than what it was. "We could sell the pieces," Jessamine said one night in February of 1882, running her palm over the seat of a finished stool whose surface she had oiled until it shone like dark honey. "In town. At the Mercantile. Maybe." Rosalind shook her head. A slow movement waited with the accumulated evidence of 20 months of sideways glances from the people of Copper Bend. "Nobody in town would buy furniture from us. Not after the way they look at us on delivery day. They would sooner sit on the floor. Then somewhere else." "Where else is there?" Jessamine did not have an answer. She wrote the question in her ledger that night beneath the week's egg tally, as though recording it might help her solve it. Where else is there? Copper Bend had one furniture maker, which was one more than a town of 143 people probably needed, but exactly the number that Burnham Craig intended to remain. Craig operated a shop on the south end of the main street, a low-slung building with a false front that made it look larger than it was, the kind of architectural dishonesty that told you everything you needed to know about the man who built it. He produced tables, chairs, bed frames, simple dressers, the utilitarian furniture of frontier life, pieces that were sturdy enough to survive daily use but possessed no beauty beyond their function, the woodworking equivalent of food that fills the stomach without pleasing the tongue. Craig was 51 years old, heavy through the shoulders and gut, with hands like slabs of cured meat, scarred from decades of rough sawing. He had come to Copper Bend from Cheyenne 12 years prior, claiming to have trained under a German cabinet maker in St. Louis, a claim that no one in town had the knowledge to verify or the inclination to doubt. He employed one assistant, a boy of 16 named Willis, whose primary function was to sweep sawdust. His prices were high because there was no alternative. His craftsmanship was adequate because adequacy was all that competition-free markets demanded. He was, in the ecosystem of Copper Bend, a small monopoly sustained not by excellence, but by the absence of anyone who cared enough to challenge him. Craig had heard about the Dunmore sisters, collecting scrapwood the way everyone in town had heard, through the reliable machinery of Dorothea Varnell's commentary, which functioned as Copper Bend's primary news service. He had dismissed it initially, with the same contempt he applied to most things that did not directly affect his income. "Two girls playing house with broken lumber," he announced at the saloon one evening in October, raising his whiskey glass to punctuate the observation. "Let them have their little hobby. Keeps them out of trouble, I suppose. Better than whatever else two unmarried women might get up to on a ranch by themselves." The laughter that followed was the particular laughter of men who did not know what they were laughing about, but understood instinctively that joining in was easier than asking questions. Harland Varnell laughed. Lemuel Stroud, who was sitting in the corner nursing a beer, did not laugh, but he did not object either, which in Copper Bend amounted to the same thing. Virgil Sumner, the minister of Copper Bend's only church, a man whose sermonic voice carried the authority of someone who had confused volume with wisdom for so long that the distinction had ceased to matter, weighed in on the matter from the pulpit the following Sunday, not by name but by implication, so transparent that the entire congregation understood exactly whom he meant. The Lord made the world in an order, he intoned, gripping the edges of the lectern with both hands in the gesture he reserved for points he considered unanswerable. Man to work the earth, woman to keep the hearth. When we step outside that order, we invite confusion into our homes, our hearts. I urge every member of this congregation to remember that strength is not the same as stubbornness, that grief is not an excuse to abandon the natural path that Providence has laid before us. Edith Crail, who owned the mercantile with her husband, offered her own assessment the following Tuesday when Jessamine came in to buy flour. Edith was a thin, precise woman who managed her store the way a general manages a campaign, with detailed inventory, strategic pricing, a comprehensive intelligence network composed of every customer who passed through her doors. She measured out Jessamine's flour with the particular care of someone who suspected the buyer might not be able to afford much more. I do not mean to pry, dear. Edith's voice carried the musical quality of someone who absolutely meant to pry. But people in town are wondering how long you girls plan to keep on the way you are. A ranch takes money. Money takes either crops, cattle, or a husband who has one or the other. Picking up scrap wood is a charming eccentricity, I suppose, but eccentricity does not pay a feed bill. Jessamine accepted the flour with a smile that cost her more effort than anyone watching would have guessed. We are managing, Mrs. Crail. Thank you for your concern. Managing is not the same as thriving, dear. Your mother, God rest her, knew the difference. Jessamine carried the flour home in silence, set it on the kitchen table, opened her ledger, reviewed the numbers that confirmed Edith Crail's assessment with the brutal impartiality of arithmetic. They were managing. They were not thriving. The gap between those two words was exactly the width of a future that might or might not exist. Spring of 1882 arrived the way spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not as a season but as a negotiation, the sun arguing with the snow for control of the landscape while the mud served as mediator, ensuring that both sides suffered equally. Rosalind planted the kitchen garden with seeds saved from last year's crop. Jessamine calculated that if the hens maintained their current rate of production through the summer, the egg money combined with what they could sell from the garden would cover their basic expenses through autumn, leaving nothing for winter beyond what was already in the root cellar, which was not enough. The workshop by then held 23 finished pieces, arranged along the walls of the barn's back at half, with the quiet pride of objects that knew they were beautiful even if no one came to look. The most recent was a rocking chair that Rosalind had built over 6 weeks of evenings from a combination of ash scraps. Its joints fitted so tightly that the chair held together by friction alone. No glue, no nails, nothing but the precision of wood meeting wood at angles that respected the grain's natural architecture. Jessamine had sanded it for 3 days, then applied 7 coats of linseed oil, each one buffed dry before the next was added, until the surface achieved a depth of color that made the recycled ash look like old mahogany. The chair was the finest thing they had made. Rosalind knew this not because she had compared it to anything, but because she had felt the difference in the making, the way a singer knows the difference between a note that is technically correct versus one that resonates in the chest. Something had shifted in her hands during the construction of that chair. The gap between what she intended to create versus what actually emerged from the wood had narrowed to almost nothing. She was no longer fighting the material. She was listening to it. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late April that the sequence of events began that would eventually burn through the comfortable distance. Copper Bend had maintained between itself. The Dunmore sisters, like a lit fuse burning toward powder. The day was ordinary, in every respect except the one that mattered. Corwin Felt, who had been delivering scrap wood past the Dunmore gate for 10 months, who had spoken perhaps 40 words to Rosalind in that time, all of them related to the species or condition of the wood he was delivering, who had noticed the calluses on her hands, the sawdust in her braid, the way she sorted the scraps with the speed of someone who already knew what she would build from each one, did something he had not done before. He stopped. Not the wagon. The wagon always stopped. He stopped himself, climbing down from the seat after the last board had been tossed, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way a man turns a thought he is not sure he should speak aloud. Miss Dunmore. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had learned that words, once released, could not be gathered back. I have hauled wood past this gate near on a year now. I confess I have wondered what becomes of it all. I do not mean to intrude. Rosalind straightened from the pile, brushing bark dust from her sleeve. She studied his face the way she studied a piece of wood before cutting, looking for the grain, the direction it ran, whether it would hold or split under pressure. She found no mockery there, no pity, only the plain curiosity of a man who noticed things that other people walked past. We build with it. Build what? The question hung between them in the spring air. Simple as a stone, heavy as the answer it required. Rosalind glanced back toward the barn, the splintered gray doors behind which 23 pieces of furniture stood in lamplight like a congregation waiting for a sermon that had not yet been written. Would you like to see? Corwin tied his mares to the fence post. He followed Rosalind across the yard, past the chicken coop where the hens tracked his unfamiliar silhouette with the suspicious attention of creatures who have learned that strangers bring either food or trouble. Jessamine appeared from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression carrying the particular pertinence of a woman who had not seen a visitor approach the barn voluntarily in 2 years. Rosalind pushed the barn doors open. Afternoon sunlight sliced through the gap, catching the sawdust that drifted perpetually in the air of the workshop, turning it golden, making the space look for a moment like the inside of a church where the incense was made of pine instead of myrrh. Corwin stepped inside. He stopped. The rocking chair stood nearest the door, its ash surface glowing in the slanted light like something lit from within. Beyond it, the stools, the tables, the chest with its dovetailed corners, the cradle Jessamine had finished the previous week, with rockers curved so smoothly they described an arc that could have been drawn by a compass. The shelves, the boxes with their fitted lids, 23 pieces of furniture that had been built from wood the world had thrown away, standing in a barn that the world had forgotten, made by 2 women the world had decided to pity. Corwin walked the length of the workshop the way a man walks through a cathedral he did not expect to find in the middle of a wheat field. He crouched beside the chest, ran his thumb along the dovetail joint, where ash met pine in a marriage so precise that the seam was barely visible. He gripped the arm of the rocking chair, testing its rigidity, finding no give, no creak. Nothing but the solid resistance of wood joined to wood by someone who understood that the joint was not merely a connection but a promise. My uncle was a cabinet maker in St. Louis before he passed. Corwin's voice had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something rawer, something that sat close to the surface of a man who had just been shown a thing he recognized from the deepest part of his memory. I spent summers in his shop as a boy. I have seen fine work before, Miss Dunmore, a great deal of it. I am telling you plainly that this is finer than most of what passes through the furniture shops back east. You are being kind. I am not a kind man by nature, Miss Dunmore. No arrogance in it, only the blunt honesty of someone who valued accuracy over comfort. I do not see the use in saying something that is not true when the truth is standing right in front of me. Does anyone else know about this? Nobody comes out here, Jessamine said from the doorway. Nobody in town would believe it if we told them. Corwin was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on the arm of the rocking chair, as though drawing something from its surface that he needed before he could speak again. Something stirred behind his eyes, a calculation, a memory, the particular look of a person who has just realized that what he is seeing changes something about what he ought to do next. He did not say what that something was. Not yet. He touched the brim of his hat, thanked the sisters for showing him, walked back to his wagon, drove on toward Copper Bend. But that evening, in his rented room at Mrs. Ferris's boarding house, he sat at the small desk by the window, pulled out a sheet of paper, considered for a long time what to write upon it, set the paper down, picked it up again, set it down, then finally wrote a letter to a man he had met at Stroud's Mill 6 months prior, a traveling photographer named Phineas Locke, who wrote stories for newspapers back east. The letter was brief. Corwin was not a man who trusted language the way he trusted wood. He said only that he had seen something at a ranch outside Copper Bend that he believed Mr. Locke would find worth the journey, something that could not be adequately described in writing because seeing it was the point. He sealed the letter. He did not mail it. He put it in his coat pocket, where it would remain for 11 days, while he considered whether sending it was the right thing to do, whether drawing attention to the sisters' work would help them or harm them, whether the world beyond Copper Bend would see what he had seen in that barn, or would see only what Copper Bend had seen from the road, 2 women with scrap wood, a story about grief instead of a story about genius. On the 12th day he mailed the letter. He did not tell the sisters he had done so. This was not deception. It was caution. The caution of a man who had watched enough things go wrong in the world to know that hope, delivered prematurely, was more dangerous than no hope at all. While Corwin's letter made its slow way eastward through the territorial mail system, Harlan Varnell made a different kind of delivery. He walked into Burnham Craig's shop on a Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to inquire about a replacement shelf bracket for Dorothea's pantry, actually to share a piece of intelligence that he believed Craig would find interesting. "Those Dunmore girls," Harlan said, leaning against the counter while Craig measured a bracket from his stock, "are not just collecting that scrap wood for burning. Corwin Felt was seen going into their barn last week, stayed a good while, came out looking like he had seen something." Craig set the bracket down. "Corwin Felt does not strike me as a man given to strong impressions. That is my point. Whatever is in that barn impressed him. My Dorothea says she has heard tapping coming from the property on still evenings. Hammering. Sounds like someone working wood in there." Craig's expression did not change. He was a man who had long ago learned to keep his reactions behind a face that gave away nothing, a skill developed over decades of negotiating prices with customers who would pay less if they sensed eagerness. But behind that face something tightened, not fear, not yet, but the preliminary contraction of a man who feels the ground shift beneath a foundation he had assumed was permanent. "Working wood," Craig repeated, as though tasting the words for poison. "2 women who cannot shoe their own horse without help are working wood. I am only telling you what Dorothea heard. Your wife hears a great deal, Harlan. Not all of it is accurate. Suit yourself." Harlan took the bracket, left a nickel on the counter. "But if I had the only furniture shop in 100 miles, I might want to know if somebody was setting up in my barn." Craig did not respond. He waited until Harlan's boots faded on the boardwalk, then walked to the window, looking south toward the road that led out of town past the Varnell property toward Whetstone Hollow, toward the Dunmore Ranch, toward a barn he had never given a moment's thought to in all the years he had lived in Copper Bend. He thought about it now. The following Monday, Burnham Craig paid a visit to Lemuel Stroud at the sawmill. The visit was framed as a social call, 2 businessmen discussing the season's timber supply over coffee in Stroud's cluttered office. But social calls between men like Craig carried the same warmth as a handshake that conceals a blade. "Lemuel, I have been meaning to discuss our arrangement." Craig settled his bulk into the chair across from Stroud's desk with the deliberate ease of a man who knows he occupies more space than the room was designed for, both physically, in every other sense that mattered. "You supply my shop with finished lumber. I pay a fair price on time every month. This arrangement has served us both well for, 9 years now?" Stroud, who was a thin man with the perpetually worried expression of someone who owed more money than he earned, nodded. 9 years come August. 9 years. Craig sipped his coffee. "A long time. Long enough to build trust, I should think. Long enough that I feel comfortable being direct with you about a matter that concerns me." "What matter?" "Your scrap wood." Craig set the cup down. "I understand your driver has been delivering it to the Dunmore Ranch on his weekly run." Stroud shifted in his chair. "It is refuse, Burnham. Waste lumber. I would burn it otherwise." "What do the Dunmore sisters do with it?" "How should I know?" "Feed their stove, I imagine." "It is not worth asking about." "Perhaps." Craig leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk between them, each finger thick as a chisel handle. "Perhaps not. I have heard talk in town that those girls may be building something in their barn. Furniture, possibly, from your scrap." "Furniture? From off-cuts?" Stroud nearly laughed. "Burnham, you have seen what comes off my waste pile. You could not build a decent outhouse from it, let alone furniture. I am not concerned with what is decent, Lemuel. I am concerned with what is possible. If 2 women are producing furniture from your waste wood, free wood that costs them nothing, they could undercut every price I charge in this territory. They could sell chairs for $1 that cost me $5 in lumber alone to produce. Do you understand the arithmetic? Stroud understood the arithmetic. He also understood the larger mathematics of his situation, that Burnham Craig purchased $300 worth of finished lumber from his mill every year, which represented roughly a third of his annual revenue, which represented the difference between staying in business, closing his doors, losing his home. What are you asking me to do, Burnham? Craig smiled, the smile of a man who had already calculated the answer to a question he was pretending to ask. I am asking you to stop giving away your scrap wood. Burn it, as you used to. If the Dunmore sisters come asking why the deliveries have stopped, tell them whatever you like. Tell them the truth if that makes your conscience comfortable. But if I learn that your mill is still supplying raw material, free of charge, to a competitor operating out of a barn, I will be forced to reconsider where I purchase my finished lumber. The mill in Spurlock, I hear, has been looking to expand its customer base. The threat was delivered with the precise caliber brain of a man who had made many such threats before, firm enough to be unmistakable, reasonable enough to be deniable, quiet enough that no witness could report it as coercion. Stroud stared at his coffee. He thought about his wife, his 3 children, the mortgage on the mill that came due in October, the price of timber versus the price of integrity, the distance between the kind of man he wanted to be versus the kind of man his debts required him to become. I will take care of it, Stroud said. I knew you would. Craig rose, set his empty cup on the desk, walked out into the May sunlight, satisfied. The machinery of prevention had been set in motion. Whatever the Dunmore sisters were building in their barn, they would build no more of it, without wood to build from. The following Tuesday, Rosalind walked to the gate at the usual hour, the hour when the sound of wagon wheels on Elk Trace Road announced the arrival of the week's scrap delivery the way a bell announces a meal. She stood at the gate in the afternoon light, her hands at her sides, her face turned toward the road, listening. She listened for a long time. The wagon did not come. Jessamine found her still standing there an hour later, the shadow of the fence post stretching long across the dirt as the sun dropped toward the ridge. The road was empty. The silence where the wagon wheels should have been was the loudest sound Rosalind had ever heard, louder than the silence in the house after their parents died, because that silence had been the absence of people she loved, while this silence was the absence of the one thing she had found to fill their place. It is not coming, Rosalind said. Still facing the road, Jessamine stood beside her sister. She did not touch her. She did not need to. The 9 minutes between their births had never been wide enough to require a bridge. No, I do not think it is. They walked back to the barn together. Rosalind lit the lantern, surveyed the workshop, the tools on the wall, the finished pieces along the sides, the dwindling pile of raw lumber in the corner. Jessamine opened her ledger, counted, calculated, wrote a number at the bottom of the page in her careful hand. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4 if we are careful. That is how much wood we have left. Rosalind reached up to the wall where her father's tools hung in careful rows. She lifted the oldest chisel, the one with the hickory handle worn smooth by Orrin's grip, the one whose steel blade still held an edge better than any of the others, despite being the most used. She turned it over in her hands. On the butt end of the handle, carved into the wood in letters so small you had to hold it close to a flame to read them, were 2 characters she had noticed before but never examined. A mark. Her father's mark she had always assumed, the kind of signature a craftsman puts on his tools the way a rancher brands his cattle. But now, standing in the lamplight with the sound of no wagon wheels ringing in her ears, she looked at the mark more carefully. It was not initials. It was a symbol, a small geometric pattern, 2 interlocking shapes that resembled the fitted joints of a dovetail rendered in miniature, carved with a precision that exceeded anything else Orrin Dunmore had ever made with his hands. Rosalind carried the chisel to the workbench. She held it under the lantern. She stared at the mark until her eyes ached. Then she looked at the floor. The barn's dirt floor had been swept smooth 100 times since the sisters claimed the back half as their workshop. But the front half, the half where Buck the mule stood in his stall chewing hay with the philosophical contentment of an animal too old to care about human problems, had a plank floor. Old planks, laid by their grandfather decades ago, silvered with age, worn into shallow valleys by generations of hooves. Rosalind had walked across those planks 10,000 times without thinking about them. They were floor. That was all. But now she remembered. The last coherent thing Orrin had said to her before the fever took his words away, mumbled from the bed where he lay dying, his hand gripping hers with a strength that did not match the weakness in his voice. The barn floor, where Buck stands. Do not forget. She had not forgotten, she had simply not understood. Grief does that, she thought. It stores things in the body that the mind is too shattered to process, locks them away in the muscles, the bones, the hands, where they wait with the same patience as wood waits for a chisel, until the moment arrives when you are finally ready to hear what they have been trying to tell you. Rosalind set the chisel on the workbench. She looked at Jessamine. "Help me move Buck." Jessamine did not ask why. The 9 minutes between them had never required explanations. She took the mule's halter, led him to the far stall, gave him an extra handful of oats for the inconvenience. Rosalind knelt on the plank floor where Buck had stood, running her fingers along the edges of the boards, searching for the one that did not fit the same as the others. She found it in the northwest corner of the stall, a plank that was slightly shorter than its neighbors, its edge not butted tight against the wall, but leaving a gap just wide enough to fit the blade of a chisel. She fit the blade of her father's chisel into the gap. She pressed down, the plank lifted. Beneath it, in a shallow space between the floor joists, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture out for God knew how many years, was a tin box the size of a Bible. Rosalind lifted it out. The tin was cold in her hands, heavier than it looked, sealed with a clasp that opened with a sound like a sigh, like something exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time. Inside the box were the missing pages from the cabinetry book. 12 sheets, carefully folded, covered on both sides with drawings in Orrin Dunmore's hand, drawings of furniture so detailed, so precise, so ambitious in their design that Rosalind's breath caught in her chest like a bird striking glass. A rocking chair with compound curves she had never seen attempted, a writing desk with hidden compartments, an armchair whose joinery involved interlocking tenons of a complexity that made the dovetails she had taught herself look like a child's first letters. Beneath the drawings, a single sheet of paper, a letter. Orrin's handwriting, shakier than the drawings. Written later, perhaps much later, the pen pressed hard enough to emboss the paper as though the words needed to be carved rather than written. Rosalind read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, while Jessamine stood behind her with one hand on her sister's shoulder, the lantern flame casting their joined shadow on the barn wall like a single figure with two heads, which in many ways was exactly what they were. The letter said, "If you are reading this, you did not give up. Your father did. 15 years ago, I sent my best work to the trade fair in Cheyenne. A man there told me I was a farmer playing at being a craftsman. He said my work was an embarrassment. I believed him. I put the drawings away. I hid them. I went back to mending wagon beds because mending wagon beds was what the world expected of me. I have regretted it every day since. These designs are the best work I never did. If you have the hands to finish what I could not start, then finish it. Build what I was too afraid to build. Do not let anyone tell you what you are not allowed to become." Rosalind set the letter down. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from grief, but from the strange, furious energy of a woman who has just learned that the battle she is fighting is not new, that her father fought it before her, that the enemy who broke him is the same enemy who is now trying to break her. "The man at the fair," Jessamine said quietly. "Do we know who he was?" Rosalind picked up the chisel again. She looked at the mark on the handle, the interlocking dovetail symbol her father had carved into his most trusted tool, the signature of a craftsman who had signed his work in the only place no one would ever think to look. "I think we do," she said. "I think his name is Burnham Craig." The lantern flickered. Outside, the wind moved through Whetstone Hollow with the sound of something turning slowly, inevitably, the way a season turns, the way a story turns when the thing buried beneath the floor is finally brought into the light. Jessamine opened her ledger. At the bottom of the page, beneath the number that said 3 weeks of wood remaining, she wrote a single line that was not a number at all. "Finish what he started." She closed the book. Rosalind hung the chisel back on the wall, the mark facing outward now. visible to anyone who walked into the workshop, a signature, a challenge, a promise made by a dead man to daughters he had trusted more than he had ever trusted himself. Outside, the road remained empty. No wagon, no wood, no rescue coming from the direction of town. It did not matter. They had the drawings now. They had the tools. They had each other, 9 minutes apart. One soul poured into 2 bodies because the work ahead was too large for one pair of hands alone. The barn door creaked in the wind. Rosalind pulled it shut against the night, against the town, against every voice that had ever told them what they were not allowed to become. Tomorrow they would find wood. Tomorrow they would begin. Tonight they read their father's drawings by lamplight until the oil ran low, tracing the lines with their fingers, memorizing the curves, learning the language of a man who had spoken his truest words, not in speech, but in the architecture of joints he had never been brave enough to cut. The lantern went out. The sisters sat together in the dark barn, shoulder to shoulder, the tin box between them, the drawings on their laps, the chisel on the wall above them, catching the last sliver of moonlight through the gap in the siding. Somewhere in Copper Bend, Burnham Craig slept the satisfied sleep of a man who believed he had solved a problem before it had the chance to become one. He was wrong. The problem had not been solved. It had been inherited, passed from a father who surrendered to daughters, who would not, carried forward in a tin box beneath a barn floor, where a mule had stood guard over it for 15 years without knowing what he was protecting. The crooked pine on the ridge above the house stood black against the stars. Beneath it, 2 headstones. Beneath the headstones, 2 people who had believed their children were capable of something extraordinary long before the children believed it themselves. The wind died. The valley settled into silence. The story was not finished. It was only beginning. The morning after the wagon failed to come, Rosalind was already in the forest before dawn. She had lain awake most of the night studying Orrin's drawings by the stub of a tallow candle, memorizing the joints, the proportions, the way her father's pencil lines curved with a confidence his spoken words had never carried. By 4 o'clock, the darkness outside the cabin window had begun to thin from black to the deep blue-gray that preceded sunrise in the Wyoming Territory, the color of a bruise just beginning to heal. She dressed without lighting a lamp, pulled on her heaviest boots, took the hand axe from the tool wall in the workshop, walked out into the cold spring air with the taste of frost on her tongue. The timber stand on the north slope of Whetstone Hollow was not Dunmore land. It belonged to no one. Technically, a stretch of territorial forest that the government in Washington had not yet surveyed, mapped, or claimed, which in the Wyoming Territory of 1,882 meant it belonged to whoever was willing to climb the slope to reach it. The trees were lodgepole pine, mostly, with scattered stands of aspen, whose white bark gleamed in the pre-dawn light like bones standing upright in the earth. The pines were tall, straight, the kind of timber that Lemuel Stroud's mill would have paid good money for if anyone had been willing to haul them down the mountain. But Rosalind was not looking for good timber. She was looking for the trees that no mill would want, the ones struck by lightning, split by wind, leaning at angles that made them dangerous to fell, the ones whose wood had been stressed by weather into grain patterns so twisted that a sawyer would curse them. Stressed wood was stronger than straight wood. This was something Orrin's drawings had taught her, a note scribbled in the margin of the armchair design. Grain that has fought the wind will hold a joint that straight grain cannot. Use the struggle. Do not discard it. It was the kind of observation that a man who had spent his life being told he was not good enough would make about wood, seeing in the material the quality that the world had failed to see in him. Rosalind felled a dead-standing pine that had been killed by beetles 2 seasons prior, its bark sloughing off in plates, its heartwood dried to a hardness that rang under the axe like a muted bell. She limbed it, sectioned it into lengths she could carry, made 3 trips down the slope before the sun cleared the ridge, each trip leaving her legs trembling, her shoulders burning, her lungs raw from the altitude. By the time Jessamine came out of the cabin with coffee, 6 lengths of beetle-killed pine lay stacked beside the workshop door, enough raw material for perhaps 1 chair, perhaps 2 small tables, depending on how much waste the knots demanded. "This is not sustainable," Jessamine observed, handing her sister the tin cup, her voice carrying not judgment, but the particular clarity of a woman who could see the mathematics of exhaustion as plainly as she saw the numbers in her ledger. Nothing about any of this has ever been sustainable. Rosalind drank the coffee in 3 swallows, the heat of it cutting through the chill that had settled into her bones during the climb. We were not sustainable when we decided to keep the ranch. We were not sustainable when we started building furniture from garbage. Sustainability is what people call the things they have already decided to believe in. We are building something nobody believes in yet. Jessamine took the empty cup. She did not argue. She went back inside, opened her ledger, began recalculating the household budget with the new variable of 0 incoming scrap wood, which meant 0 free raw material, which meant every piece of furniture they built from this point forward would cost them in labor what it had previously cost them nothing. Over the following 2 weeks, the sisters established a routine that would have killed most people half again their size. Rosalind rose before dawn every other morning to climb the north slope, felling dead standing timber, hauling it down by hand with Buck's reluctant assistance. The mule, ancient as he was, still possessed the sure-footed stubbornness of an animal who had spent his entire life navigating terrain that horses refused, picking his way down the rocky slope with logs roped to a crude travois that Rosalind had built from fence rails. On alternate mornings, she worked the timber in the workshop, splitting it, rough-shaping it with the draw knife, setting the pieces aside to season in what little airflow the barn provided. Jessamine managed everything else: the garden, the hens, the meals, the ledger, the careful rationing of linseed oil which could not be replaced without a trip to Edith Crail's mercantile, where questions would be asked that neither sister wanted to answer. She also continued her design work, refining the sketches in her notebook, translating Oren's ambitious drawings into step-by-step construction sequences that Rosalind could follow, breaking the complex joinery down into individual cuts the way a composer breaks a symphony into measures. The armchair from Oren's designs haunted both of them. It sat at the center of the drawings like a keystone in an arch, the piece around which all the other designs seemed to orbit, the most technically demanding object their father had ever conceived. Its frame required compound curves cut from solid stock, each leg tapering in 2 dimensions simultaneously, meeting the seat rail through a joint that interlocked at 3 separate angles. Jessamine studied the drawing for 4 days before she understood how the joint was supposed to work. When she finally did, she sat back from the workbench with an expression Rosalind had never seen on her sister's face, something between awe at their father's ingenuity, fury at the waste of it. He could have been extraordinary. Jessamine's voice was barely audible over the wind pressing against the barn walls. This joint, this one connection, is more sophisticated than anything in the cabinetry book. He invented it. A man mending wagon beds in a barn in Wyoming invented a joint that furniture makers in Philadelphia would study for years. He was extraordinary, Rosalind corrected, selecting a piece of the beetle-killed pine, turning it in her hands, reading its grain. He was simply extraordinary in a place that had no use for it. Rosalind's first attempt at the armchair joint failed on the 3rd cut. The tenon split along a hidden fault in the grain, sending a crack through the wood with a sound like a finger snapping. She stared at the ruined piece for a long time, then set it aside, selected another, began again. The 2nd attempt failed on the 5th cut. The angles were correct, but the tolerances were too tight, the wood binding against itself instead of sliding into place. 3rd attempt, 2nd day, better, the joint almost seating before the shoulder cracked under mallet pressure. 4th attempt, 3rd day, the wood too green from insufficient seasoning, swelling after assembly, popping the joint apart overnight. Each failure consumed wood they could not afford to waste. Each failure consumed time they could not afford to spend. Jessamine tracked the material losses in her ledger with the dispassionate accuracy of a field surgeon counting casualties, noting beside each entry the cause of failure so that the pattern could be studied, understood, avoided. It was on the 5th attempt, on the evening of the 4th day, that Rosalind felt something shift beneath her hands. The chisel moved through the wood with a fluency she had not experienced before. Not the labored precision of someone following instructions, but the instinctive flow of someone who had finally internalized the logic of what she was building. The joint slid together with a whisper of wood against wood, seating itself with a firmness that needed no glue, no clamp, no mechanical force. Only the geometry of two pieces shaped so precisely that gravity alone held them in their intended relationship. Jessamine tested the joint by gripping the tenon, lifting the entire assembly off the workbench. It held. She turned it over, examining the seam from every angle, running her fingertip along the line where the two pieces met, feeling for the gap that should have been there, finding none. This is it. Jessamine set the assembly down with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. This is what he meant. This is what he wanted someone to finish. The full armchair took 3 more weeks. Rosalind shaped each component with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that the chair was not merely furniture but a message, a letter written in wood from a dead father to a living world saying, "I was here. I could do this. I chose not to, because the cost of trying was higher than the cost of silence. My daughters have decided that the cost of silence is higher." Jessamine finished the surface over 5 days, sanding through progressively finer grits until the beetle-killed pine, which had entered the workshop, looking like something rescued from a fire, emerged with a luminous depth that made visitors, when visitors finally came, touch it involuntarily, the way people touch things they cannot quite believe are real. The armchair was finished on a Tuesday evening in late June of 1882. The sisters, what sat in the center of the workshop, stepped back, regarded it in the lamplight. Neither spoke for several minutes. The chair occupied the space with the quiet authority of an object that knows exactly what it is, requiring no explanation, no defense, no context beyond its own existence. Its curved arms caught the light along their compound surfaces, each angle revealing a different shade in the grain. The wood struggle against wind encoded in patterns that now served as ornament, the scars of survival transformed into beauty. Rosalind thought of her father standing at the trade fair in Cheyenne, holding something he had made with the best of himself, watching a stranger's face as the stranger told him it was worthless. She thought of him driving home afterward, the silence inside his chest heavier than anything in the wagon bed. She thought of him burying the drawings beneath the barn floor, not because he had stopped believing in them, but because he could not bear to look at them every day, reminders of the man he might have been if one moment of cruelty had not convinced him otherwise. We will never hide our work under a floor. Rosalind's hand rested on the arm of the chair the way it might rest on the shoulder of someone she was making a promise to. Whatever happens, whatever anyone says, we will never put it in a box underground because someone told us we were not allowed. 3 days after the armchair was completed, Corwin Felt appeared at the gate of Dunmore Ranch carrying a load of scrap wood on the back of a borrowed cart. He was no longer driving Lemuel Stroud's wagon. He had not driven it for 3 weeks, not since the Tuesday the delivery stopped, because Corwin had gone to Stroud the morning after the missed delivery, asked why, received an answer that was honest enough in its evasion to confirm what Corwin already suspected. Stroud could not say who had pressured him. He did not need to. In a town with one furniture maker whose income depended on the absence of competition, the arithmetic of motive was simple enough for anyone willing to do it. Corwin had spent the intervening weeks working his regular mill shifts while spending his evenings collecting scrap lumber from sources Stroud's prohibition did not cover. Fallen fence rails from abandoned homesteads, storm-damaged boards from a collapsed line shack on territorial land west of Copper Bend, offcuts begged from the carpenter at Fort Fetterman, 40 miles north, who was happy to part with them for $1. Corwin loaded these pieces onto a cart he borrowed from Mrs. Ferris's stable, drove them to the Dunmore gate on his day off, presented them to Rosalind with the matter-of-fact demeanor of a man returning something that had been wrongly taken. Mr. Stroud told me he was instructed to stop the deliveries. Corwin stood at the gate with sawdust on his coat, his eyes holding the particular steadiness of someone who has already calculated the cost of what he is about to do. He would not say by whom. I expect you can guess. Rosalind looked at the cart, the scrap wood piled haphazardly, pieces of different species jumbled together, pine against oak, against something that might have been elm. It was not the curated refuse of Stroud's mill, sorted by weekly familiarity into predictable categories. It was chaos. It was also the most generous thing anyone outside her family had done for her in 2 years. You bought this with your own wages. I did. Why? Corwin removed his hat, turned it in his hands, the gesture she now recognized as the physical manifestation of a man organizing words he was not accustomed to speaking. "Because my uncle's shop in St. Louis made beautiful things for 20 years before he died, Miss Dunmore. Nobody in this territory remembers his name. Nobody kept his work. I watched a lifetime of craftsmanship disappear like it never existed, because nobody thought to protect it while the man was still alive. I will not watch that happen twice." Rosalind stepped aside. Corwin drove the cart through the gate, unloaded the wood beside the workshop door. Then, because he was already there, because the evening was long, because the armchair was visible through the open barn door, calling to him the way beautiful things call to people who recognize beauty, not as decoration but as evidence that the world contains more than it admits, he walked into the workshop. He stopped in front of the armchair. His reaction was different from the first time he had entered the barn, months ago, when he had been surprised by the quality of what he found. This time he was not surprised. He was shaken. He crouched beside the chair, examined the compound joint where the arm met the front leg, traced the geometry of the interlocking tenons with his finger, straightened slowly with an expression that carried weight. "Who taught you this joint?" His voice was careful, the carefulness of a man who suspects the answer will change something. "This is not in any book I have ever seen. Our father designed it." Jessamine stepped forward from the workbench, holding the original drawing, Orrin's pencil lines still sharp on the yellowed paper. "He hid his designs under the barn floor before he died. We found them after the wood deliveries stopped." "Why did he hide them?" Rosalind answered. "Because 15 years ago he took his best work to a trade fair in Cheyenne. A man there told him he was a farmer playing at being a craftsman. He believed it. He put the drawings away, never tried again. We believe the man who said it was Burnham Craig." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a puzzle completing itself, the last piece sliding into position with a click that is felt rather than heard. Corwin looked at the chair. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the chisel on the wall with the dovetail mark on its handle, Orrin's signature, the craftsman's name written in the only language he trusted. "Your father's joint has a flaw." Corwin's voice was quiet, not unkind, the voice of someone delivering a truth he wished were not necessary. "The third tenon, the one that locks the other two in place, its shoulder is cut at 87 degrees. It should be 85. At 87, the joint will hold under static load, but will loosen over time with repeated stress, rocking, leaning, the weight of a body shifting in the seat. My uncle corrected this exact problem in his own work. 3 degrees of difference between a joint that lasts a decade versus one that lasts a lifetime." Rosalind stared at him, not with offense, not with gratitude, but with the focused intensity of a student who has just met the teacher she did not know she needed. "Show me." Corwin took the drawknife from the wall. He selected a scrap of oak from the pile he had just delivered. In 12 minutes, working with a speed that came not from haste, but from the deep muscular memory of a boy who had spent summers in a St. Louis cabinet shop watching an old man's hands until the watching became knowing, he cut a sample joint identical to Orrin's design except for the 3-degree correction. He fitted the pieces together, handed the assembly to Rosalind. She tested it, twisted it, pressed the joint laterally, the direction that would simulate years of a body rocking in a chair. The joint did not move. "Your father was a brilliant designer," Corwin continued, wiping sawdust from the blade. "But he worked alone. Brilliance without feedback is like a compass without a map. It can tell you which direction is true, but it cannot tell you when you have wandered 3 degrees off course." From that evening forward, Corwin came to the workshop every night after his mill shift ended. He did not announce this as a decision. He simply appeared, the way the scrap wood had appeared, the way the drawings had appeared, each arrival feeling less like coincidence than like the slow assembly of something that had always been intended, but whose pieces had needed time to find each other. His contributions were specific, practical. He corrected the angle tolerances in Orrin's designs based on techniques his uncle had perfected. He taught Rosalind a method for testing grain direction before cutting that reduced waste by a third. He showed Jessamine how to mix linseed oil with beeswax to create a finish that resisted water. A formula his uncle had guarded jealously during his working life, secret Corwin had carried for 8 years without anyone to give it to. In exchange, the sisters taught him things he did not know he needed to learn. Rosalind showed him how scrap wood, stressed, knotted, imperfect, could be read like a text whose meaning was encoded in its flaws, each knot a chapter, each twist in the grain a sentence that told the story of the tree's struggle against the elements. Jessamine showed him that proportion was not mathematics but music, that the relationship between the height of a chair back, the depth of its seat, the angle of its legs was not calculated but felt, the same way a singer feels the interval between two notes without counting the frequencies. The workshop became, during those long June evenings, something none of them had experienced before. A collaboration, a place where three people with different gifts worked toward a single object without competing for ownership of the result. The armchair was disassembled, the flawed joint recut to Corwin's corrected angle, the chair rebuilt. When it was finished for the second time, it was better than it had been before, which is the nature of things that are made by more hands than one. Rosalind found herself anticipating Corwin's arrivals with an alertness she did not examine too closely. She noticed the sound of his boots on the gravel path before he reached the barn door. She noticed the way he held the draw knife, left hand forward, right hand back, the reverse of how she held it, so that when they worked side by side their movements mirrored each other like a conversation conducted entirely in gesture. She noticed these things the way she noticed grain direction, automatically, without deciding to, because noticing was what her hands did when they were near something that mattered. Jessamine noticed her sister noticing. She recorded this observation nowhere, not in the ledger, not in her sketchbook, not in speech. Some things, she understood, needed to be left alone to develop at their own pace, the way wood needed to season before it could be worked, forced drying producing cracks that patient air drying avoided. In the first week of July, Corwin mailed the letter to Phineas Locke. He had carried it in his coat pocket for over 2 months. By then, the paper softened by handling, the ink faded slightly by sweat. He told Rosalind he had written to someone who might be interested in seeing the workshop. He did not oversell the possibility. He did not use words like opportunity, future, chance. He said only that a man he had met at the mill wrote stories about unusual things for newspapers back east, that the man might come, might not, that either outcome was beyond their control. Rosalind heard this news with a stillness that Jessamine recognized as the particular composure her sister adopted when she was afraid of hoping. Hope, for Rosalind, was a tool she had learned to handle carefully, the way a person handles a blade that has cut them before, with respect for its edges, awareness that the same instrument that builds can also wound. Phineas Locke arrived at Dunmore Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late July, driving a wagon loaded with photographic equipment, his wooden camera box strapped to the tailgate with leather belts, an ink-stained notebook tucked into the breast pocket of a coat that had been expensive once, several territories ago. He was a lean man in his early 40s, sharp-featured, with the particular restlessness of someone whose curiosity had always outpaced his ability to satisfy it, leaving him perpetually in motion, perpetually en route to the next thing that might hold his attention long enough to justify the journey. He had come expecting little. Corwin's letter had been vague, deliberately so, describing the workshop in terms so restrained that Phineas had almost discarded the invitation. What convinced him to make the trip was not the description of the furniture, but a single line near the end of Corwin's letter. These women build from what the world throws away, and what they build is better than what the world keeps. Phineas stood in the workshop doorway for a full minute without entering, his eyes adjusting from the bright July sun to the amber dimness of the barn interior, the finished pieces emerging from the shadows, the way a developing photograph emerges from chemical solution, first shapes, then details, then the full image resolving into clarity. He walked the length of the workshop the way Corwin had walked it months before, but where Corwin had moved with the measured step of a craftsman evaluating technique, Phineas moved with the hungry quickness of a storyteller, recognized shape of a narrative he had not known he was looking for. He lifted chairs, examined undersides, held a small carved box up to the slant of light coming through the siding. He spent 3 minutes studying the armchair, running his thumb along the corrected joint, making sounds in his throat that were not words. "May I ask who taught you this work?" He finally turned to the sisters, his notebook already in his hand, his pencil poised with the urgency of a man who knows that the next sentence spoken in this room might be the one he has traveled 800 miles to hear. No one. Rosalind's voice was level, unburdened by false modesty. Our father left tools behind we taught ourselves. From one book, Jessamine added, stepping forward. One book, a set of hidden drawings, a great many failures. Phineas Locke spent 3 days at the ranch. He photographed every finished piece, arranging each one in the workshop to catch the light that fell through the gaps in the barn siding. He photographed Rosalind at the workbench, with the draw knife in her hands, sawdust drifting in the air around her like snow falling indoors. He photographed Jessamine applying finish to the arm of the rocking chair, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, the linseed oil gleaming on her fingertips. He photographed the chisel with Oren's mark, the tin box, the drawings, the letter. He filled 47 pages of his notebook in a cramped, hurried hand that even he sometimes could not decipher afterward. On the second evening, sitting at the kitchen table over a meal of beans, cornbread, early tomatoes from the garden, he told the sisters what he intended to do. I intend to write about this, not as a curiosity piece, though I will not pretend some readers will see it that way at first. I intend to write about it because it is honest work made honestly by two people the world decided to overlook. I think that story matters more than most of what I have written in 10 years of this trade. Nobody will care what 2 ranch women in Wyoming are doing with scrap lumber. Rosalind spoke without bitterness, simply stating what experience had taught her, the way a person states the temperature, acknowledging a fact without expecting it to change. Phineas smiled, the brief, sharp smile of someone who has heard 1,000 people say the same thing before being proved wrong. You would be surprised, Miss Dunmore, how many people are tired of hearing about things that came easy. The world remembers the things that were hard. The article appeared 6 weeks later in a regional paper out of Cheyenne. From there, as such things sometimes traveled in a country knit together by rail mail, merchant routes, reprints found their way east. A shortened version appeared in a Denver paper. A paragraph was excerpted in a St. Louis circular. Letters began arriving at the Copper Bend post office, addressed to Rosalind and Jessamine Dunmore, furniture makers, some from curiosity, some from admiration, 3 from buyers inquiring about commissions. Copper Bend reacted the way small towns react to evidence that contradicts their settled opinions, with denial first, then confusion, then the slow, reluctant renegotiation of certainty that feels, to those undergoing it, remarkably like indigestion. Newspaper nonsense. Harland Varnell dismissed the article at the mercantile counter, waving his hand as though clearing smoke. Some fool writer needed a story, made those 2 into something they are not. I read the article. Edith Crail measured sugar into a bag with the careful precision of a woman who took accuracy personally. It was quite detailed. Photographs, Harland. Photographs do not exaggerate. Photographs show what a photographer wants them to show. I could photograph Buck the mule standing in front of the governor's mansion. That does not make him the governor. Buck would do a better job than the current one, Edith observed, closing the sugar bag with a knot that ended the conversation. Virgil Sumner addressed the matter from the pulpit with the oblique ponderousness that was his signature pastoral style. We must be cautious of earthly fame. Pride goeth before destruction. A woman's greatest achievement is not the work of her hands, but the keeping of her home. Several women in the congregation shifted in their pews with the particular discomfort of people hearing something they had always been told but had never entirely believed. Burnham Craig said nothing publicly. He read the article in his shop, thus alone, standing at his workbench, with the newspaper spread flat beside a half-finished table whose joints were held together with the because Craig had never learned to cut a mortise clean enough to hold by friction alone. He read the descriptions of the Dunmore sisters' joinery, the dovetails, the compound tenons, the armchair with its interlocking joints. He read the phrase finer than most of what passes through the furniture shops back east, attributed to an unnamed associate of the sisters. He read it twice. He folded the newspaper carefully, set it on the bench, placed his hands flat on either side of it. His hands were shaking, not from anger, from recognition. 15 years ago, at the Cheyenne Trade Fair, he had stood in front of a display of furniture made by a quiet rancher from the Wyoming backcountry, a man named Oren Dunmore. who had brought 3 pieces to the fair, hoping someone would see in them what he saw in himself. Craig had seen it. He had seen it immediately, the way a mediocre painter recognizes mastery in another's brushwork with the instant, involuntary precision of someone who knows exactly how far the gap extends between his own ability versus what is standing before him. He had not praised Oren's work. He had destroyed it. Not the physical pieces, but the man behind them, using words aimed with the accuracy of someone who understood that the fastest way to eliminate a competitor was not to outperform him, but to convince him he was not worthy of competing. A farmer playing at being a craftsman. The phrase had come to Craig effortlessly, the cruelty of it indistinguishable from honesty in the way that the most effective lies always are. Oren Dunmore had taken his pieces home. He had never brought them to a fair again. Craig had not thought about the man since. The way a person does not think about a fence post he kicked over on a walk, the destruction too small, too incidental, to occupy memory. Now the fence post's daughters were building furniture that made his own work look like what it was. Adequate, competent, forgettable. Craig walked to the window of his shop. He looked out at the main street of Copper Bend, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows from the false-fronted buildings, each shadow taller than the structure that produced it, the way shadows always are. He thought about Lemuel Stroud, who had followed his instructions to cut the scrap wood supply. He thought about the letters arriving at the post office, the article reprinting itself across the territory like a fire that could not be stamped out because it was feeding on oxygen he could not remove. He thought about the armchair, the compound joints, the corrected angles that Corwin felt had taught the sisters, angles that Craig himself did not know, had never learned, would never be able to replicate because the gap between his hands versus what those hands would need to become was 15 years of practice he had spent instead on adequate, competent, forgettable work that sold only because no one in 100 miles offered anything better. He sat down at his workbench. He picked up a nail. He drove it into the half-finished table with a single blow of his hammer, the sound of it ringing through the empty shop like a door slamming. The letters at the post office continued to arrive. Then, on a bright morning in early October of 1882, a man stepped down from the stagecoach in Copper Bend wearing a suit that had been tailored in a city where tailoring was a profession rather than a chore, carrying a leather case, asking directions to the Dunmore Ranch with the polite certainty of someone who was accustomed to finding what he looked for. His name was Aldrich Pemberton. He represented a furniture concern in Denver that supplied homes, hotels, commercial establishments across the Colorado Territory. He had read Phineas Locke's article. He had been skeptical. He had made the journey expecting to be disappointed because experience had taught him that journalism frequently inflated rural talent into something that dissolved upon direct inspection. He arrived at the Dunmore gate, introduced himself, was led to the barn by Rosalind without preamble, because Rosalind had learned by now that the work spoke more persuasively than any explanation she could offer. She watched Pemberton's face as he entered the workshop, tracking the precise moment when his professional skepticism encountered the armchair, the rocking chair, the chest with its dovetailed corners, the accumulated evidence of 2 years of work that had been built from nothing by women the world had decided to overlook. Pemberton's hands moved over the furniture the way Corwin's had, testing joints, checking tolerances, lifting pieces to examine their undersides. His expression completed a journey from polite reserve through surprised attention to something that settled in the lines around his eyes like a verdict delivered silently, a professional recognition that what he was seeing did not fit the categories he had brought with him from Denver. "I would like to place an order." He set down the small carved box he had been holding to the light, his voice carrying the measured formality of a man who had learned that enthusiasm in business transactions cost money, for as many pieces as you can produce in the coming year. "I would also like to discuss a standing arrangement beyond that, if you are amenable." The numbers he spoke at the kitchen table over coffee were larger than anything the sisters had handled since their parents' death, larger than the ranch had earned in its best year of cattle, crops, eggs combined. Jessamine wrote the figures into her ledger with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from the sensation of a wall giving way, a wall she had braced herself against for so long that its sudden absence felt less like relief than like vertigo. Pemberton departed the following morning on the stagecoach back to Cheyenne, carrying with him a handshake agreement, 2 photographs Phineas had left with the sisters, a small box Jessamine had given him as a sample, its dovetailed joints so precise they were invisible to any eye that did not know to look for them. The trembling in Jessamine's hand had not stopped. It traveled from her fingers into her chest, where it became something she recognized from the moment their mother had told them she was expecting them to survive being born, the flutter of a future announcing itself inside a body that was not sure it had room. "We need more wood." Rosalind stood in the workshop doorway, looking at the dwindling stock of scrap lumber along the walls, calculating the gap between what they had versus what the Denver order would require. More than the forest, more than Corwin's cartloads. We need what Stroud used to give us, the volume, the variety. Oak, ash, cherry if he has it. Stroud will not give it, not while Craig holds his lumber contract over him. Then we buy it. With what money? Pemberton's order is a promise, not payment. We will not see $1 until we deliver finished pieces. The sisters looked at each other across the workshop, the space between them charged with the particular electricity of a problem that had no solution within the boundaries of what they currently possessed. The answer, when it came, would not come from them. It came from Lemuel Stroud, who appeared at their gate 3 days after Pemberton's visit, driving his own wagon, which was unusual because Stroud rarely left the mill during business hours, carrying on the wagon bed not scrap wood but finished lumber, quarter-sawn oak, planed ash, 12 board feet of black cherry that he had been saving for a special order that had never materialized. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground, looking at the sky, looking at everything except the 2 women standing before him, because Lemuel Stroud was a man whose conscience had been accumulating interest for 5 months, the debt compounding daily until the weight of it exceeded whatever Burnham Craig's threats could counterbalance. I read the article. His voice was rough, the roughness of a man speaking through the constriction of shame. I knew Craig was wrong to make me cut your supply. I knew it when I did it. I told myself it was business. A man has to protect his livelihood. That is what I told myself. He paused. The wind moved through Whetstone Hollow, carrying the sound of the creek, the distant complaint of Buck in his stall, the small sounds of a world continuing to operate while a man decided what kind of person he would be from this moment forward. Your father came to my mill for years, bought small lots, rough lumber for fence rails, porch steps. He never talked much about what else he could do with wood, but once, just once, he showed me a dovetail joint he had cut from a scrap of walnut, held it up to the light. The seam was invisible. I told him it was fine work. He put it away, never showed me another. I did not think about that moment again until I read what that newspaper man wrote about your workshop. Then I remembered. I remembered the look on your father's face when he put that joint away. Like he was putting away a part of himself he had decided the world did not deserve to see. Stroud cleared his throat. This lumber is not charity. It is an account. You pay when you can. Fair price, no interest, no deadline. If Craig takes his business to Spurlock, so be it. I have carried his weight long enough. Rosalind accepted the lumber without speaking, because some debts of gratitude are too large for words that exist, requiring instead the language of action, of taking what is offered with the understanding that the acceptance itself is the thanks. The workshop expanded over the following weeks with a momentum that felt, to the sisters, like a river that had been dammed for years finally breaking through. Corwin, who had been fired from his position at Stroud's mill 2 weeks after the article appeared, Craig having pressured Stroud to dismiss the man who had set the entire chain of events in motion, was now working at the ranch full-time. His labor compensated by a share of the Denver contract that the 3 of them agreed upon one evening over the kitchen table, Jessamine recording the terms in her ledger with the formality of a woman who understood that fairness documented was fairness preserved. The Denver order required 14 pieces, delivered by March of 1883. 4 chairs, 2 tables, the armchair, a rocking chair, a writing desk adapted from Oren's designs, 3 small boxes, a cradle. Jessamine planned the production schedule with the precision of a military campaign, allocating specific pieces to specific weeks, tracking wood consumption against inventory, projecting completion dates that accounted for the inevitable failures, The cracked tenons, the warped panels, the splits that appeared without warning in wood that looked sound until the chisel revealed the flaw hidden inside. November brought the first hard frost. December brought snow that piled against the barn walls in drifts 3 feet deep. The sisters installed the cast-iron stove Corwin had salvaged from the abandoned line shack west of town. Its chimney punched through the barn roof with a collar of tin to keep the sparks from reaching the dry timber above. The stove changed the workshop from a space they could use 8 months of the year to one they could use 12, the heat pushing back the cold enough that fingers could grip a chisel without going numb, though the extremities still ached by the end of a long evening's work. Rosalind, Corwin, Jessamine worked through the winter the way the wood itself endured the winter, by resisting, by holding their grain against the pressure, by refusing to crack in the places where cracking would have been easiest. The pieces accumulated along the workshop walls, each one finished, inspected, approved by a committee of 3 whose standards had been set not by the market but by the memory of a man who had buried his best work under a floor rather than offer it to a world he no longer trusted. By late January of 1883, 11 of the 14 pieces were complete. The armchair, rebuilt with Corwin's corrected joints, stood at the center of the collection like the keystone of an arch. The writing desk, adapted from Oren's most complex design, featured hidden compartments whose mechanisms Jessamine had refined through 4 iterations until the drawer fronts clicked open with a touch so light it felt like the desk was offering its secrets willingly. Then the second article appeared. It was published in a Spurlock newspaper, a 4-paragraph piece with no byline, no photographs, no named sources. Questioned the authenticity of the Dunmore Workshop's output. It suggested, through implication rather than direct accusation, that the furniture attributed to 2 self-taught women was in fact the work of a male associate, a former mill employee whose presence at the ranch had been noted by several unnamed observers. The article did not name Corwin Felt. It did not need to. In a territory where gossip traveled faster than newsprint, the implication was sufficient. Rosalind read the article standing at the post office counter in Copper Bend, the paper shaking slightly in her grip, not from distress but from the particular vibration of controlled anger, the kind that runs through a person's body like a current searching for ground. "This is Craig." She folded the paper, placed it in her coat pocket. "He cannot outbuild us, so he is trying to outlie us." 4 days later, a letter arrived from Denver. Aldrich Pemberton wrote that he had been made aware of questions regarding the provenance of the Dunmore Workshop's output. He was not canceling the order. He was, however, postponing his next visit to the ranch until the matter could be clarified. He hoped the sisters would understand that his firm's reputation required him to exercise due diligence. He remained, he wrote, their respectful servant, a phrase whose formality made Rosalind want to throw the letter into the stove. Jessamine opened the ledger that evening. The numbers told a story that did not require interpretation. They had spent 6 months of labor, their entire reserve of savings, the last of Stroud's credit, on 14 pieces of furniture whose buyer was now uncertain. The ranch's operating expenses had been deferred, not eliminated. Feed for Buck, seed for the spring garden, oil for the lamps. The modest sum Corwin was owed for his months of work. If Pemberton did not come through, they would be worse than where they had started. They would be in debt, with a barn full of furniture nobody local would buy, in a town that had already decided what they were. How long? Rosalind's question was addressed to the ledger as much as to her sister. 6 weeks. Jessamine's pencil tapped the bottom line. After that we cannot feed Buck, let alone ourselves. The night was cold. The stove in the workshop ticked as its metal contracted in the cooling air. Rosalind sat on the finished armchair, the one piece she could not bring herself to package for shipment because it felt like shipping a piece of her father to a stranger. She sat there in the dark after Jessamine went inside to sleep, listening to the barn creak in the wind, thinking about Oren at the trade fair, thinking about the look on his face when he put his joint away, the look Lemuel Stroud had described, the look of a man closing a door on himself. She was still sitting there at midnight when she smelled the smoke. It came from the east wall of the barn, the old wall, the one built by her grandfather, its boards so dry after decades of weather that they would burn the way paper burns, fast, bright, total. Rosalind was on her feet before the thought completed itself, her body responding to the smell with the instinct of someone who has lived her entire life in wooden structures on open grassland, where fire was not a metaphor but a verdict. She threw open the workshop doors. The east wall was burning from the outside, flames climbing the dry boards with a speed that turned seconds into arithmetic, each second equaling another foot of fire, another irreplaceable piece of furniture caught in the advancing heat. The smoke billowed inward, thick, acrid, the combustion of old pine releasing decades of stored sunlight in a single furious exhalation. Rosalind did not scream, she moved. She grabbed the two nearest chairs, one in each hand, carried them through the doors into the yard, went back. Jessamine appeared from the cabin in her nightclothes, took in the scene, without needing explanation, began hauling pieces from the workshop with the silent efficiency of a woman whose ledger had already calculated the cost of every object in the building. Corwin came running from the direction of the road. He had been walking back from the boarding house when the glow became visible above the trees, his coat half-buttoned, his boots unlaced, his hands bare despite the cold. He went straight for the armchair. The fire had reached the east wall's interior surface. By then, the boards splitting open to release tongues of flame that licked along the wastes, catching the sawdust that coated every surface of the workshop in a fine, flammable layer. The armchair stood against the south wall, not yet burning, but surrounded by a perimeter of heat that made the air shimmer. Corwin lifted the chair, heavier than it looked because the beetle-killed pine was dense as stone, turned toward the door, felt the ceiling joist above him give way, dropped to one knee under the falling timber, took the burning wood across his shoulders, shrugged it off, kept moving, the armchair pressed against his chest, his hands wrapped around its arms in a grip that would leave burns on both palms. He cleared the door. Rosalind caught the chair as his knees buckled, lowering it to the ground while Jessamine doused his hands with water from the horse trough, the hiss of heat leaving skin mixing with the roar of the fire behind them. They saved 19 pieces. 4 burned. The east wall was gone, the roof above it collapsed into a heap of glowing timbers that would smolder for 2 days. The west wall held. The workbench survived. The tools on the wall survived, including the chisel with Oren's mark, which hung exactly where Rosalind had placed it, untouched by fire, as though the flames had recognized it as something they were not permitted to destroy. The 3 of them stood in the yard at 2 in the morning, surrounded by furniture arranged on the frozen grass like a displaced congregation, watching the remains of the east wall burn itself down to coals. Corwin's hands were wrapped in strips torn from Jessamine's nightgown. Rosalind's face was streaked with soot, her braids singed at the end, her eyes reflecting the dying fire with an intensity that went deeper than the flames. "Craig." Jessamine's voice was flat, emptied of everything except the word. "We cannot prove it." Rosalind stared at the ruins. "We do not need to prove it. We need to survive it." The fire had taken 4 finished pieces, 3 months of seasoned lumber, the east wall of a barn their grandfather had built. It had not taken the armchair. It had not taken the tools. It had not taken the drawings which Rosalind had moved to the cabin after finding them, storing them in the tin box under her bed. It had not taken the sisters' ability to rebuild, which was the one resource that no arsonist could destroy, because it existed not in wood or walls but in the accumulated knowledge of their hands, their eyes, their partnership, their grief transformed into skill that no fire could burn, because it was not made of anything that burned. Rosalind picked up the chisel from the wall. She held it in the firelight, Oren's mark visible on the handle, the interlocking dovetails glowing amber. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 3 generations of Dunmores, who had been told what they were not allowed to become. "He did not stop our father. He will not stop us. Tomorrow we load what survived onto the wagon. We drive to Denver ourselves. Pemberton wants proof that we made this work. We will bring the proof to his door." Jessamine looked at her sister. Corwin, his burned hands cradled against his chest, at the smoking ruins, at the armchair standing untouched on the frozen grass, its compound joints holding firm, its surfaces reflecting the last of the firelight, with the warm, steady glow of wood that had been finished by hands that refused to stop. She opened her ledger. Below the numbers that described their financial ruin, below the inventory of what was lost, Below the timeline that said 6 weeks until they could no longer feed themselves, she wrote a line that was not a number. "We drive at dawn." She closed the book. Rosalind loaded the armchair onto Corwin's borrowed cart with a tenderness that contradicted the ferocity in her eyes. Corwin climbed onto the driver's seat, his bandaged hands taking the reins with a wince he tried to hide, failing, not caring. Jessamine would stay behind to guard the ranch, the remaining stock, the tools, the drawings. It would be the first time the sisters had spent more than a single night apart since the day they were born, since the 9 minutes of separation that their mother used to say was God's way of testing whether one soul could survive being poured into 2 bodies. The cart rolled out through the gate before the sun cleared the ridge. The wheels cut tracks in the frost that would melt by noon, leaving no trace of the passage except in the memories of the woman left standing at the fence, watching until the cart disappeared around the bend in Elk Trace Road. Jessamine stood at the gate until the sound of the wheels was gone. Then she turned back toward the ruined barn, the surviving pieces arranged in the yard like evidence at a trial whose verdict had not yet been decided. She had work to do, walls to rebuild, a workshop to resurrect, a ledger to balance against odds that the numbers said were impossible. The numbers had been wrong before. The road to Denver crossed 2 mountain passes, a frozen river ford, 70 miles of high plains where the wind came at the wagon sideways with the force of something personal. Rosalind drove the first day while Corwin rested his burned hands in his lap, the reins wrapped around her wrists because her fingers had gone numb by noon, the cold finding every gap in her coat, her gloves, her resolve. The armchair sat in the wagon bed behind them, wedged between the rocking chair, the writing desk, 3 boxes whose dovetailed corners caught the thin winter sunlight whenever the road turned south. 11 pieces total, everything they had saved from the fire, packed in blankets Jessamine had pulled from her own bed because the workshop blankets had burned. They did not speak much during the first hours. Silence between Rosalind. Corwin had always been comfortable. The silence of 2 people who understood that words were a secondary language, useful when needed, unnecessary when the primary language of shared work, shared purpose, shared proximity said everything the moment required. But this silence was different. It carried weight. Not the weight of things unsaid, but the weight of things that had already been said by the fire, by the burns on Corwin's hands, by the fact that he had run into a collapsing building to save a chair he did not own because the chair represented something he could not bear to see destroyed. Rosalind watched the road. She watched the mare's breath steaming in the cold. She watched her own hands on the reins, the calluses, the scars, the evidence of 2 years of work written on her skin in the permanent ink of labor. She thought about her father's hands, which had carried the same calluses, the same scars, the same encoded history of making. She thought about how Orrin's hands had stopped making things 15 years before they stopped beating. How the death of his craft had preceded the death of his body by more than a decade, the cruelest inversion of the natural order, a man's passion dying while the man himself was forced to go on living without it. My uncle stopped building furniture 3 years before the cancer took him. Corwin's voice broke the silence without disrupting it, the way a stone breaks the surface of still water without disturbing the depth beneath. People always said the illness killed him. I knew better. He stopped building first. The rest was just his body catching up to what his spirit had already decided. Why did he stop? Age. Arthritis in his fingers. He could not hold a chisel steady anymore. He tried for months, sharpening the blades thinner, switching to softer wood, changing his grip. Nothing worked. The last piece he attempted was a jewelry box for my aunt. He ruined it 3 times, maple each time. After the 3rd attempt, he put his tools in a crate, carried them to the attic, sat down at the kitchen table, told my aunt he was done. Rosalind held the reins through a rut that jarred the wagon hard enough to shift the furniture in the bed. Did she understand? She understood he was grieving. She did not understand what he was grieving for. She thought it was the carpentry. It was not. It was the conversation. Every piece he built was a conversation between his hands. The wood. When his hands could not hold up their end of the conversation anymore, he lost the only language he had ever been fluent in. A man who loses his language does not stop being a person, but he stops being the particular person he was. My uncle spent his last 3 years as a stranger in his own body, alive but not present, occupying the space where someone he recognized used to live. The wagon crested the first pass at dusk. Below them, the high plains opened toward the south, the distant lights of ranch houses scattered across the darkness like fallen stars, each one representing a life that had chosen this hard, beautiful, indifferent country as its home. Rosalind pulled the wagon off the road beside a creek whose banks were armored with ice, unhitched the mares, built a fire from deadfall while Corwin unpacked the provisions Jessamine had loaded: jerked venison, hardtack, a jar of the blackberry preserves Dorothea Varnell had brought to the ranch months ago, in the period between her apology that had not yet happened, the judgment that had preceded it. They ate in the firelight, sitting on the tailgate of the wagon with the armchair behind them, its surfaces catching the flames' glow in ways that made the grain patterns shift like living things. The beetle-killed pines struggle against wind, insects, weather now visible as a kind of beauty that only existed because the tree had survived long enough for someone to find it, cut it, shape it, reveal what the struggle had produced. When we reached Denver, Rosalind said, her breath visible in the cold air between them, Pemberton will want to know whether we made this work ourselves. The Spurlock article planted the doubt. He will look at you, at your hands, at your presence, draw conclusions. He will conclude that a man helped. Corwin set down the venison. Which is true. I did help. I corrected your father's joint angles. I taught you grain reading techniques. I contributed labor, knowledge, material. None of that changes the fact that the designs are your father's. The skill is yours, your sister's. The vision that turned scrap wood into something worth driving 70 miles through a blizzard to sell belongs to 2 women, not to me. Pemberton may not see it that way. Then Pemberton needs to look harder. They slept in the wagon bed, on either side of the armchair, wrapped in the remaining blankets, the cold pressing against them from every direction, the stars overhead sharp enough to cut. Rosalind lay awake for a long time, listening to Corwin's breathing, listening to the fire settling into coals, listening to the particular sound the wind made when it passed through the compound curves of the armchair's arms, a low harmonic that was almost music, the ghost of a note trapped in wood shaped by a dead man's imagination, liberated by his daughter's hands. She slept. She dreamed of her father standing at a workbench she had never seen, in a workshop that did not exist, building something she could not identify, his hands moving with a speed, a certainty that she had never witnessed in his living body, as though death had freed him from the doubt that had constrained his motion in life. He looked up, he saw her, he did not smile. He nodded once, the nod of a craftsman recognizing another craftsman, the acknowledgement that requires no words, because the work itself is the only credential that matters. Denver in February of 1883 was a city being built by its own ambition, construction scaffolding rising on every other block, the streets a chaos of horse traffic, freight wagons, pedestrians moving with the purposeful aggression of people who had come west to become something they could not have become where they started. Rosalind drove the wagon through streets wider than any she had seen, past buildings 3 stories tall whose facades were stone instead of wood, past shop windows displaying goods whose prices would have fed the Dunmore Ranch for a year. Pemberton's furniture concern occupied a 2-story brick building on Larimer Street, its ground floor a showroom whose contents Rosalind could see through the plate glass windows as she pulled the wagon to the curb. Chairs, tables, sideboards, desks, the inventory of a business that supplied the territory's growing appetite for domestic comfort, each piece competently made, uniformly finished, interchangeable in the way that factory-influenced production made things interchangeable, stripping the individual marks of the maker's hand in favor of consistency that could be replicated, scaled, sold. Rosalind climbed down from the wagon. She straightened her coat, which was stained with road dust, smelling of wood smoke from the fire. Her braid had come partially undone during the drive, loose strands framing a face that carried the accumulated evidence of 2 days on the road, 2 months of crisis, 2 years of grief, 25 years of being underestimated by every person she had ever met except her sister, her parents, the man climbing down from the seat beside her with bandaged hands that testified to the cost of believing in someone else's work. She walked into the showroom. Aldrich Pemberton was standing behind a walnut counter whose surface was polished to a mirror finish, reviewing a ledger that was probably 3 times the size of Jessamine's. He looked up when the door opened, registered Rosalind's road-worn appearance with the practiced discretion of a businessman who had learned that customers came in all conditions, adjusted his expression from surprise to neutral courtesy in the space of a breath. "Miss Dunmore." His voice was careful, the voice of a man navigating between the desire to be fair versus the obligation to protect his investment. "I was not expecting you in person. I was not expecting to come in person, Mr. Pemberton. Circumstances changed. I read about certain, questions that were raised regarding your workshops. Regarding whether 2 women can build furniture without a man guiding their hands." Rosalind's voice was level, carrying no anger, no defensiveness, only the blunt clarity of someone who has driven 70 miles through winter to have a conversation she should not have needed to travel for. "I brought the furniture itself, Mr. Pemberton. It is outside in the wagon. I suggest you examine it, rather than examine the claims of an anonymous article written by a man who has never set foot in our workshop." Pemberton followed her outside. Corwin had already lowered the tailgate, the 11 pieces visible in the gray February light, the blankets pulled back to reveal surfaces that glowed against the dull backdrop of the street, the wagon, the winter sky. Pemberton moved among the pieces the way he had moved through the barn workshop months ago, with the methodical attention of a man whose livelihood depended on the ability to distinguish genuine craft from imitation. He tested joints, he examined grain. He lifted the writing desk's false front, discovered the hidden compartment, opened it, closed it, opened it again with the particular focus of a professional encountering a mechanism he had not seen before. Then he reached the armchair. He sat in it. Not to test its comfort, though the comfort was immediate, the seat depth, the back angle, the arm height calibrated by Jessamine's proportional instinct into a relationship that received the human body the way a well-fitted garment receives the frame it was made for. He sat in it to feel the chair respond to his weight, to sense whether the joints held, whether the structure distributed force the way a properly engineered piece of furniture should, through the frame into the floor, the chair becoming an extension of the ground beneath it rather than an object balanced precariously upon it. He sat for a full minute, then he stood. He walked around the chair. He crouched beside it, examined the compound joint where the arm met the front leg, the interlocking tenons visible only if you knew to look for them, their seams tighter than a line drawn with a sharpened pencil. Who designed this joint? His professional reserve had cracked, not broken, but cracked, the way a dam cracks when the pressure behind it exceeds the capacity of the structure to contain it. Our father. Rosalind stood beside the wagon, her arms at her sides, her voice carrying the weight of the answer the way the chair carried the weight of the man who had just sat in it. He designed it 15 years ago. He never built it. A man at a trade fair told him he was not a real craftsman, that his work was an embarrassment. Our father believed him. He buried the designs under our barn floor. We found them after someone cut off our supply of scrap wood, because the same man who destroyed our father's confidence was afraid we would succeed where our father had given up. The man's name? Burnham Craig. He operates the only furniture shop in Copper Bend. He is the source of the anonymous article you read. He pressured our mill supplier to cut our raw materials. He fired Corwin from his position at the mill for helping us. We believe he set fire to our workshop 3 weeks ago, destroying 4 finished pieces, our lumber stock, the east wall of the barn our grandfather built. Pemberton looked at the armchair. He looked at the wagon, the road dust on its wheels, the worn harness on the mares, the bandages on Corwin's hands. He looked at Rosalind, whose face gave away nothing except the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had brought her best work 70 miles through the cold because she had run out of other ways to prove what should never have needed proving. "Miss Dunmore, I owe you an apology." Pemberton removed his hat, which was something he did, Rosalind would later learn, only when he meant something completely. "I allowed an unsigned newspaper article to make me hesitate. That was a failure of judgment on my part. The work in this wagon does not require authentication. It authenticates itself." He walked back inside. He returned with a document, a contract, prepared. He explained, before her arrival, because he had intended to mail it once the questions were resolved. The terms were larger than the original verbal agreement, 22 pieces per year, a standing order renewable annually. Pemberton's firm would handle shipping, marketing, sales. The sisters would retain naming rights, design control, sole authorship credit. I have one additional request. Pemberton set the contract on the tailgate beside the armchair. This chair, I would like to display it in my showroom, not for sale, as a demonstration piece. I want every customer who walks through my door to sit in it before they buy anything else. I want them to understand what furniture can be when it is made by someone who treats wood as a collaborator rather than a commodity. Rosalind placed her hand on the arm of the chair. The beetle-killed pine was warm despite the February cold, as though the wood had retained some memory of the fire it had survived, carrying the heat forward the way living things carry the memory of every danger they have outlasted. She thought of her father, who had designed this chair in secret, hidden it in shame, died without knowing whether it would ever exist outside the pages where he had imagined it. She thought of Corwin, who had carried it through a burning building with bare hands. She thought of Jessamine, alone at the ranch, rebuilding walls, balancing ledgers, holding the line. Leave it exactly as it is. Rosalind lifted her hand from the arm. Do not refinish it. Do not repair the scorch mark on the back left leg where the fire touched it. That mark is part of the story. A chair without scars is a chair that has never been tested. Pemberton nodded. He wrote the instruction into the margin of the contract. Below the armchair, in the display that would occupy the front window of his Larimer Street showroom for the next 7 years, he placed a small brass plate engraved with words Rosalind dictated standing on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold air, her voice steady. Dunmore Workshop, Whetstone Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Built from reclaimed wood by Rosalind, Jessamine Dunmore, designed by Orrin Dunmore, 1867, completed by his daughters, 1882. The journey home took 2 days. The wagon was lighter, carrying only the provisions, the blankets, the signed contract folded in Rosalind's coat pocket, where Corwin's letter to Phineas Slock had once waited for the courage to be mailed. The mares moved faster without the furniture's weight, sensing the direction of home the way animals sense what humans rationalize, directly, without deliberation. They talked during the drive home, not about the contract, not about the money, not about the future those things might purchase. They talked about wood, about grain patterns, seasoning times, the particular resonance of black cherry versus white oak under a plane blade. They talked the way two people talk when they have discovered that the thing they share is not merely an interest but a language, a way of understanding the world that makes more sense to them than any other language they have learned. Rosalind noticed, during a long silence crossing the second pass, that Corwin's bandaged hands were resting on his knees, palms up, the posture of a man who was not guarding his injuries but displaying them, unconsciously, the way a soldier's scars face outward, not from pride, but from the simple physical fact that wounds received while moving forward will always be on the front of the body. She reached across the seat. She placed her hand over his, carefully, avoiding the burned places, resting her calloused palm against the uninjured skin of his wrist. She held it there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she returned her hand to the reins. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them needed to. Some conversations are complete in a single gesture, the way a perfect joint is complete in a single fit, requiring no glue, no reinforcement, nothing beyond the precision of two surfaces meeting at exactly the right angle. They arrived at Dunmore Ranch at dusk on the second day. Jessamine was standing at the gate, which Rosalind recognized as unusual because Jessamine was not a woman who stood at gates waiting for things. Jessamine was a woman who sat at tables working on things, whose patience expressed itself through productivity rather than vigilance. Her presence at the gate meant something had happened. Something had happened. Burnham Craig had come to the ranch. He had come alone on foot, without tools, without intent visible in his posture or his expression, walking up Elk Trace Road from the direction of Copper Bend with his hat in his hands, his heavy shoulders rounded forward in a way that made his large body look diminished, compressed. a structure whose internal supports had given way while the external walls remained standing. Jessamine had met him at the gate. She had not invited him through it. She stood on her side of the fence, he on his, the boundary between them maintained by the particular geometry of a woman who understood that the man standing before her had tried to destroy everything she loved. He had spoken first. His voice, which Jessamine had only ever heard at a distance, raised in the saloon or projected across the mercantile, sounded different at close range. Stripped of the performance that public speaking required, reduced to the raw material beneath, which turned out to be smaller, rougher, more damaged than the finished product had ever suggested. "I did not come to ask forgiveness, Miss Dunmore. I do not believe I am entitled to it." "Then why did you come?" "Because if I do not say this to someone who deserves to hear it, I will spend the rest of my life being the man I have been, instead of someone different. At my age, the rest of my life is not long enough to waste on being someone I despise." He told her about Cheyenne, about the trade fair 15 years prior, where a quiet rancher from Whetstone Hollow had displayed 3 pieces of furniture that were better than anything Craig had produced in his entire career. He told her how he had stood in front of those pieces, felt the gap between Oren's ability versus his own open beneath his feet like a crevasse, felt the particular terror of a man who has built his livelihood on the assumption that he is the best at what he does, suddenly confronted with evidence that he is not even close. "I told your father his work was an embarrassment." Craig's voice carried the specific texture of words that have been rehearsed so many times they have worn grooves in the speaker's throat. "I told him a farmer had no business pretending to be a craftsman. I said it loudly in front of other men because I knew that shame delivered publicly is harder to recover from than shame delivered in private. I wanted to make sure he never tried again. It worked. He never did. You destroyed him." Jessamine's voice was quiet, not from restraint but from the particular stillness that precedes the most important sentences a person will ever speak. "You did not merely insult his work. You took from him the belief that he was allowed to be who he truly was. He spent the last 15 years of his life building fence rails instead of furniture because you were afraid of what he could do. Yes, you cut our wood supply. Yes, you had Corwin fired. Yes, you burned our barn." The pause that followed was long enough for the wind to shift direction, carrying the smell of charred timber from the ruined east wall across the yard, physical evidence of the crime arriving at the precise moment the confession required it. "Yes." Craig's voice broke on the word, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet fracture of something that had been holding itself together through force of will for too long. "I set the fire. I came at night when I believed you were asleep. I used lamp oil on the east wall because the boards were dry enough to catch without much help. I told myself I was protecting my business. That is what I told myself. It was not true. I was protecting my idea of myself, the idea that I was a furniture maker, a craftsman, a man whose work had value. Your father's work threatened that idea. Your work destroyed it." Jessamine stood at the gate, the cold February wind pulling at her braid, her ledger visible in the pocket of her apron where it always was, the numbers inside it recording the cost of every piece this man had destroyed, every month of struggle his sabotage had extended, every sleepless night his cruelty had inflicted. She thought of Rosalind driving through a blizzard to Denver. She thought of Corwin's burned hands. She thought of her father's drawings hidden under a floor for 15 years because the man standing in front of her had been too small to tolerate the existence of someone larger. "You took 15 years from our father." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Some sentences carry their weight in precision rather than volume. 15 years he could have spent being the man he was designed to be. You cannot give those years back. You cannot undo the damage by confessing it. Confession without restitution is just another form of selfishness, Mr. Craig. It lightens your burden while leaving ours exactly where it was. What restitution would you accept? None. There is nothing you possess that compensates for what you took. But I will tell you what you can do. You can leave this valley. You can close your shop. You can stop selling furniture you know is mediocre to people who deserve better. You can stop occupying the space that belongs to someone whose work is worthy of it. Craig stood at the gate for a long time after Jessamine finished speaking. The sun was setting behind the ridge, casting the crooked pine above the graves into silhouette, its shadow falling across the yard like a salt, marking an hour that existed outside ordinary time, the hour when a man's reckoning arrives not through punishment imposed from outside but through the far more devastating mechanism of understanding. Finally, completely, irreversibly, exactly what he has done. He put his hat on. He turned. He walked back down Elk Trace Road toward Copper Bend, his footprints in the frost visible for exactly as long as it took the evening air to melt them. What Jessamine did not know, standing at the gate watching him go, was that the confession had not been private. Lemuel Stroud, who had come to the ranch to deliver a second load of lumber on credit, had arrived on the road from the opposite direction. He had stopped his wagon 50 yards from the gate when he saw Craig standing there. He had sat in his seat, holding his mares quiet, listening to every word. By the following morning, every person in Copper Bend knew that Burnham Craig had burned the Dunmore barn. The town's response was not dramatic. Small towns do not produce drama. They produce consensus, the slow accumulation of individual judgments that coalesce into a collective decision as invisible, as irresistible as a change in weather. Craig's shop was not vandalized. His windows were not broken. No mob appeared at his door. Instead, the town simply stopped buying from him, stopped greeting him on the street, stopped including him in the nods, the hat tips, the brief exchanges that constituted the social architecture of a community of 143 people. He became, in the space of a week, invisible, present but unacknowledged, alive but unrecognized, the precise inverse of what he had done to Orrin Dunmore 15 years before. Craig closed his shop on the 1st of March. He left Copper Bend on the 5th, driving a wagon loaded with his tools, his unsold inventory, the accumulated evidence of a career spent building things that were adequate, competent, forgettable. Nobody watched him go. Nobody needed to. His absence was sufficient. What arrived to fill that absence came from a direction nobody expected. On a Saturday morning in mid-March, Rosalind walked out of the cabin to find 8 people standing in her yard. Harlan Varnell, Dorothea, Lemuel Stroud, Edith Crail, her husband, Virgil Sumner. 2 ranchers from the far end of the valley whose names Rosalind knew, but whose faces she had never seen up close because they had never come close enough to be seen. They carried tools: hammers, saws, nails, rope, a wagon load of fresh-cut timber from Stroud's mill. Dorothea stepped forward, her weathered face carrying an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from the judgment it had worn for 2 years, arriving at something more complicated, more costly, more earned. "We have come to rebuild your wall, Miss Dunmore." Dorothea's voice was steady, stripped of its usual performative edge. "We understand if you would rather we did not. We understand we have not earned the right to stand in your yard. But we are here. The lumber is here. The morning is here. If you will let us, we would like to do something useful with all 3. Rosalind looked at the 8 faces. She looked at Jessamine, who had appeared in the cabin doorway. She looked at the ruined east wall of the barn, the charred timbers still standing like the ribs of an animal that had died but refused to fall. She thought about her father, who had spent 15 years hiding from a town that had not known him well enough to protect him. She thought about whether protection offered too late was still protection, whether a wall rebuilt, the people who had watched it burn, was stronger or weaker than one rebuilt alone. "The coffee is on." Rosalind stepped aside. "The east wall opens toward the sunrise. If you start there, the light will be with you all morning." They raised the wall in a single day. Eight people working with the coordinated efficiency of a community performing penance through labor, each nail driven into fresh timber, carrying a weight beyond its mechanical function, fastening not just boards but the town's fractured relationship with 2 women it had spent 2 years misunderstanding. Virgil Sumner, whose sermons had questioned the propriety of women working with their hands, spent the afternoon handing nails to Rosalind while she drove them with 3 blows each, the rhythm of her hammer steady as a heartbeat. He did not offer commentary. The hammer said everything. By sunset the east wall stood, new wood against old, the fresh lumber pale beside the silver-gray boards of the original structure, a visible seam between what had been destroyed, what had been rebuilt. The barn bore its scar the way the armchair bore its scorch mark, openly, without apology. the evidence of damage integrated into the story rather than erased from it. Corwin hung a new sign above the barn doors the following week. He carved it himself from a plank of the beetle-killed pine, burning the letters with a heated iron the way ranch brands were burned into hide. The sign read simply, "Dunmore Workshop." The weeks that followed carried a momentum that felt different from anything the sisters had experienced. It was not the desperate momentum of survival, the frantic energy of running to stay in place. It was the calm momentum of something that has found its course, the way a river moves after it clears the rapids, still fast, still powerful, but no longer fighting the landscape, flowing with it. Pemberton's first payment arrived in April. Jessamine recorded it in her ledger with a hand that did not tremble, because trembling was for doors opening unexpectedly, while this was a door she had pushed open herself. The amount covered the ranch's debts, Corwin's back wages, the lumber credit from Stroud, seed for the spring garden, feed for Buck, who had survived another winter through sheer biological stubbornness, the mule equivalent of refusing to sell the ranch. The Denver contract's first delivery shipped in May, 12 pieces packed in straw, loaded onto a freight wagon that Stroud provided at cost. Pemberton wrote back 3 weeks later. Every piece had sold within days of being displayed. The armchair in the front window had become, he reported, the most discussed object on Larimer Street. Customers came in specifically to sit in it. Several had attempted to buy it. He had refused them all, per Rosalind's instruction, because the chair was not inventory. It was testimony. Letters continued arriving at the Copper Bend post office. Orders from Denver, inquiries from Cheyenne, a commission request from a hotel in San Francisco whose owner had seen the armchair during a buying trip. Jessamine managed the correspondence with the same precision she applied to the ledger, each letter answered within 3 days, each inquiry evaluated against the workshop's capacity, each commitment recorded with the understanding that a promise made on paper was a debt owed in wood. Phineas Locke returned in June, carrying a copy of a second article, this one published in a national periodical, featuring the photographs he had taken the previous summer alongside new images of the rebuilt barn, the workshop sign, the expanded collection. The article's headline, which Phineas had not written, because headlines were written by editors who understood what sold papers better than photographers understood what mattered, read, "The sisters who built an empire from firewood." Rosalind disliked the word empire. Jessamine disliked the word firewood. They both understood that the article's exaggerations would bring more letters, more orders, more demand for work that was limited by the number of hours 2 women, 1 man could spend at a workbench before their bodies required sleep. They needed help. By autumn of 1883, the workshop's backlog extended 8 months into the future. Rosalind, Jessamine, Corwin could not fill it alone. The question was not whether to hire but whom, because the particular nature of their work, the attention to grain, the precision of joinery, the refusal to compromise on finish, required hands that understood wood not as raw material but as a partner in a conversation that lasted the lifetime of each piece. The first apprentice arrived in September, a young woman named Hazel Bramford from the neighboring valley, 18 years old, the daughter of a blacksmith whose hands already knew the grammar of tools, even if they had not yet learned the specific dialect of wood. Rosalind taught her to read grain. Jessamine taught her to see proportion. Corwin taught her the 3-degree correction that separated a joint lasting a decade from one lasting a lifetime. By December, Hazel was producing boxes whose dovetails passed Jessamine's inspection on the first attempt, a milestone that Rosalind herself had not achieved until her 8th month of practice. A second apprentice followed in January of 1884, a quiet man named Douglas Pratt, referred by Pemberton, who had spent 10 years in a Denver furniture factory producing identical chair legs on a lathe, 600 per day, until the repetition had nearly extinguished whatever spark had led him to woodworking in the first place. At the Dunmore workshop, where no 2 pieces were identical, where the wood itself determined the final form through its grain, its knots, its particular history of growth, stress, survival, the spark reignited. Douglas cried the first time he completed a chair whose joints he had cut by hand, fitted by feel, finished by touch. He did not explain the tears. Nobody asked him to. The workshop in the autumn of 1884 bore little resemblance to the barn where two grieving sisters had once knelt on a dirt floor, sorting scrap lumber by lamplight. The structure had been reinforced, expanded, fitted with proper windows that filled the interior with the steady north light that woodworkers prized for its clarity, its refusal to cast the deceptive shadows that southern light produced. The tools on the walls had multiplied, Corwin's uncle's professional set joining Orrin's original collection, old tools beside older tools, each generation's instruments hanging in rows that told the story of the craft's transmission from hand to hand across decades, miles. The stubborn persistence of knowledge that refused to die even when the people who carried it did. Rosalind, Corwin occupied the farmhouse together by then, a transition that had occurred without announcement, without ceremony. The way truly important changes often occur, not through dramatic declaration but through the gradual, irreversible accumulation of small decisions. She moved her father's tools to the workshop. He moved his uncle's tools beside them. She made room in the cabin's single closet. He filled the room with the smell of sawdust, linseed oil, the specific warmth of a man who worked with his hands until they ached, then worked through the aching because the work mattered more than the pain. Jessamine, who had monitored the progression with the silent satisfaction of a woman who understood that some things needed to season before they could bear weight, noted the change in her ledger with a single entry, household, 2 adults, adjusted accordingly. The 9 minutes between the twins had widened, not through distance but through the natural expansion of a life that was no longer defined solely by the bond between two sisters. Jessamine moved into the second bedroom of the cabin. The arrangement worked, not because it was perfect, but because perfection, like sustainability, was a word for things people had already decided to believe in. What the three of them had was better than perfect. It was functional, earned, honest, built from the materials at hand. 5 years passed. The workshop grew, the apprentices multiplied. The Dunmore name traveled through the territory, the region, the country, carried by Pemberton's sales network, by Phineas Locke's ongoing coverage, by the simple mechanism of objects that outlast the conversations about them, chairs that held bodies, tables that held meals, cradles that held children, each piece carrying in its grain the encoded story of scrap wood, transformed by patience into something the world had not known it needed until it existed. In the autumn of 1889, the Dunmore workshop employed 6 craftspeople, including Hazel Bramford, who had become Rosalind's primary instructor, teaching new apprentices the grain-reading techniques that Rosalind had taught her, which Orrin had written about in his hidden drawings, which the beetle-killed pine had taught Orrin by existing, by dying, by waiting decades for someone to find it worthy of attention. The chain of knowledge extended backward into time, forward into hands that had not yet been born, the particular immortality of craft, which survives not through monuments but through the transmission of skill from one pair of hands to the next. Jessamine designed. She had not touched a chisel in years, not because she could not, but because her gift had always been vision rather than execution, the ability to see the finished piece inside the raw wood the way a sculptor sees the statue inside the marble. Her sketchbooks filled a shelf in the workshop, 23 volumes by 1,889, each one containing drawings that ranged from practical production designs to impossible fantasies, furniture for houses that did not exist, for rooms she would never enter, for lives she imagined with the same precision she applied to her ledger, every line deliberate, every proportion felt. On a cool morning in October, exactly 7 years after Aldrich Pemberton had first sat in the armchair on Larimer Street, Rosalind climbed the ridge above the ranch house, the familiar path worn deeper than it had been in her parents' time by the annual pilgrimage she made each autumn. Jessamine climbed beside her, carrying a small cedar box they had built together the previous winter, its lid inlaid with interlocking rings that echoed the dovetail symbol on Orrin's chisel. The pattern passed from generation to generation, like a word in a language that could only be spoken in wood. They knelt together at the 2 headstones beneath the crooked pine. The tree was still there. Orrin had never cut it down. Rosalind would never cut it down. It stood as it had always stood, impractical, unnecessary, beautiful in its refusal to be what the landscape expected it to be. We finished what you started. Rosalind set the cedar box between the graves, her voice carrying across the ridge to no one except the air, the stone, the tree that had outlived the man who had loved it too much to remove it. Every design, every joint, every piece you were afraid to build, we built them. The valley stretched below, gold in the autumn light, the ranch house, the workshop, the new sign above the barn doors, the smoke from the chimney where Corwin was making breakfast, the figures of Hazel, Douglas, the other apprentices arriving for the day's work, tiny at this distance, distinct as notes in a chord that required all of them to sound complete. He would have wanted to see this, Jessamine said. He does see it. Rosalind took her sister's hand, the grip familiar, calloused, warm. Every joint we cut is a conversation with him. Every piece we finish is a letter he receives. The dead do not stop listening just because we stop speaking to them. They hear us in the work, they always have. They sat together on the ridge until the sun climbed high enough to warm the stone, the grass, the crooked pine, whose shadow shortened as the morning aged. Then they stood, brushed the dust from their skirts, walked back down toward the barn where the day's work waited. Years passed. The workshop grew. The country changed. The territory became a state. The frontier became a memory. The chairs, the tables, the boxes, the cradles traveled outward from Whetstone Hollow into homes across the American West, each one carrying in its grain the story of its origin, scrap wood from a sawmill, shaped by hands that had learned their craft from grief, refined it through failure, perfected it through the stubborn refusal to accept that the world's judgment of what was worthless was the final word on the subject. In 1920, 38 years after two sisters had knelt in the dirt, sorting through sawmill refuse while a town laughed from a comfortable distance, a young woman climbed the narrow stairs to the attic of the ranch house in Whetstone Hollow. Her name was Marguerite Felt. She was 17 years old. She had her grandmother Rosalind's hands, her great-aunt Jessamine's eye for proportion. She was looking for a box of old fabric her mother had sent her to find for a quilt. She did not find the fabric. She found, instead, a cedar box whose lid was inlaid with interlocking rings, stored beneath a beam in the attic's far corner, covered in 30 years of dust. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a chisel with a hickory handle worn smooth by generations of grip, its butt end carved with a small geometric pattern, two interlocking shapes that resembled dovetails rendered in miniature. Beside the chisel, a leather-bound sketchbook filled with drawings in a hand she recognized from the workshop downstairs, where Jessamine's designs still hung on the walls beside the tools. Beneath the sketchbook, a photograph, its edges yellowed, its image still sharp. Two women standing before a barn, each holding a tool, their faces turned toward the camera, with expressions that held neither smile nor severity, but something between, something steady, something that said, "We were here. We made this. We did not stop." Marguerite sat on the attic floor, the cedar box open in her lap, the dust motes drifting in the light from the small window, the house quiet around her except for the distant sound of hammering from the workshop below, where the current generation of Dunmore apprentices were building furniture from wood that had once been trees, that had once been seeds, that had once been nothing at all, until someone decided to see in them what no one else could see. She opened the sketchbook to the first page. Jessamine's handwriting, faded but legible. The ink a deep brown that had aged into something resembling the color of the linseed oil she had spent her life applying to wood. Wood does not ask who you are. It only asks whether you have the patience to listen. Marguerite closed the book. She picked up the chisel, turned it over in her hands, felt the weight of it, the balance, the particular warmth that old tools carry, the accumulated heat of every hand that has ever held them, stored in the grain of the handle the way memory is stored in the grain of wood, permanently, silently, waiting for the next hand to pick it up, carry it forward, continue the conversation that began before she was born, that would continue after she was gone. Carried the box downstairs. She walked into the workshop. She hung the chisel on the wall beside the other tools, Oren's originals, Corwin's uncle's professional set, the instruments acquired over decades of growth, each one a word in a language that had been spoken in this barn since before the barn had walls. Since before the walls had been burned, rebuilt, scarred, healed, the chisel hung on its nail. The dovetail mark faced outward, visible to anyone who entered the workshop, which by 1920 was a building known across 3 states, visited by apprentices, buyers, journalists, craftspeople who came to learn the techniques that Orrin Dunmore had invented in secret, that his daughters had perfected in defiance, that their students had carried forward into a century that was rapidly forgetting the value of things made slowly, carefully, by hand. The mark on the chisel was small. You had to lean close to see it. But once you saw it, you understood. It was not a signature. It was not a brand. It was a promise, made by a man to his daughters, kept by his daughters to the world, that the things we build from what others discard are not lesser for their origins but greater, because they carry in their grain the proof that patience, grief, love, given enough time, enough steady hands, can transform what the world calls waste into what the world will one day call extraordinary. The workshop door stood open. Morning light fell across the tools, the workbenches, the half-finished pieces waiting for the day's hands to continue what yesterday's hands had begun. Outside, the crooked pine on the ridge stood against the sky the way it had always stood, impractical, unbowed, refusing to be anything other than exactly what it was. Marguerite picked up a draw knife. She selected a piece of wood from the pile. She began to work.